The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 151. The brave man is not alone. At this time, although European countries had signed a declaration prohibiting the slave trade market was still stable point. As long as there is a market, there will be demand. North and South America are in urgent need of a large number of high-quality slaves, so European merchants continue to transport black slaves from Africa to North and South America to make high profits among them. The most demanding countries are the United States, Texas, French colony, Brazil, and Argentina, Cameroon, Congo, Ethiopia, and the Cape Colony before the arrival of the British were all important during this period. Slave trading center. Although there are not many black people in Argentina now, the number of black slaves imported back then was not large at all. At this time, Argentina only had hundreds of thousands of people. In order to increase the labor force, it had to import black slaves. If France chose to colonize these places at this time, it would be like pulling out a tooth from a tiger's mouth. Not only would he have to deal with powerful local forces, but he would also have to defeat all the major powers in Europe one by one. Namibia, on the other hand, does not have to worry about any powerful country jumping out to compete with Austria, and the weak indigenous people are even more vulnerable. Diamonds, gold, and copper, which was very valuable during this period, the vast arable land on the plateau, and the geographical location that was easy to defend, but difficult to attack, all were in line with Franz's wishes. The development of the colony could not be completed overnight, and Franz had more troublesome things now. He felt that he should go to Hungary in person. The storm in Hungary this time is much more destructive than the storm in history. A large part of the reason for this is that the completion of the Danube Dam Austria section has further raised the water level of the Danube, and at the same time, the destructive power downstream will be reduced, become stronger. Although the devastating floods in Hungary in history were astonishingly destructive, there were only tens of thousands of victims. They were forced to flow into the city out of desperation, and were almost consumed without causing much trouble. This time, coupled with the help of some nobles in Hungary, the number of victims reached hundreds of thousands at the same time. The effect of disaster relief was very poor. Several attempts by Hungary victims to rob manors and grain depots were upheld. According to Franz's estimation, someone must be hoarding or planning something. Franz would not be able to draw conclusions about these things without taking a look and walking around. The Austrian military is already planning to attack Hungary. Once an uprising breaks out in Hungary, the Austrian army will attack the rebels from three directions: Graz, Galicia, and Transylvania. If Hungary asks for help. Hungary, Budapest. No one followed in Szécheny's footsteps, so he could only accept it and move on. Szécheny admired the Austrian Empire's approach to disaster relief very much. He took out a large sum of money from the bank. He wanted to do a major thing that no one had done before, to connect Buda and Pest. Széchenyi construction of the chain bridge officially started. At the same time, he planned to invest 3 million florins to strengthen the river embankments to prevent the Danube from changing its course. Széchenyi did everything he could, but the flood of victims continued like the waters of the Danube. Not only did many nobles laugh crazily at Széchenyi's behavior, but some unscrupulous businessmen took the opportunity to drive up prices, make unscrupulous money, and watch Count Széchenyi's jokes. However, he did not despair, but placed his hope on the next generation. He knew that he alone could not save Hungary. As a result, Széchenyi found his childhood friend, the Hungarian Minister of Education at this time, and asked for a list. He decided to sponsor those Hungarian students who were both good in character and academics, regardless of whether they were nobles or not. Among them was the Petrovich family, whose house and fields were destroyed by the cold floods, as well as the livestock grazing on the grass. He had lent money to acquaintances and relatives before, but no one was willing to return the money to him after the disaster. Petrovich was destitute and homeless, and could only live in other people's houses. His son Petofi had to drop out of school and work as a butcher to make ends meet. Until Count Széchenyi found their family and promised that, as long as Petofi could pass the entrance exam to Pest's high school, and if they keep their grades above average, their family will receive a scholarship of 300 dong per year. There are many people in Hungary like the Petrovich family, and Széchenyi is deeply in debt as a result. Drought, floods, and droughts. Count Széchenyi could only lament the impermanence of the world. He did not expect that these disasters would happen one after another. He felt that he needed to go to Vienna again. Maybe the royal family would help him. Mrs. Sophie was opposed to Franz's idea of going to Hungary. She could not understand Franz's approach. Do you really believe that old bastard Russia called you a born saint? You are a little pervert and can't even walk when you see a beautiful woman. If you are a saint, who am I, madam? Sophie poked Franz on the forehead with her fan, obviously very unhappy. This matter may be much more serious than you think. After all, Hungary is the territory of the Habsburg family. We should not sit back and let those irreversible things happen. Mrs. Sophie understood what Franz meant, but said it disdainfully. That's what they asked for. Why didn't there be a wave of refugees in other parts of the Austrian Empire for the same amount of money? And you don't have to worry, the empire's army is very powerful, and it's just a good opportunity to show off the military might of the Austrian Empire and let those in Hungary nobles have less other thoughts. Mother, it is best to avoid things like civil war. In the end, the only ones injured are the subjects of the Austrian Empire. Don't you always say that if you can't get it on the battlefield, you can't get it at the negotiation table? If you don't hurt them, how will they know they are wrong? Mrs. Sophie started to tease Franz. Mother, shopping malls are like battlefields. I'm indeed going to fight, but fighting does not necessarily involve bloodshed. What? If you can't come back in Hungary? Franz's safety is what Mrs. Sophie cares most about. She doesn't want her eldest son to encounter any accidents. Don't I still have 2 younger brothers? If anything happens to me in Hungary, then the Austrian Empire will have every reason to completely cleanse Hungary and cancel their autonomy. Then why don't you let your 2 brothers go? Should Maximian support Hungarian independence? Or should Ludwig go find his mother? Mrs. Sophie could only sigh helplessly. She knew that her eldest son, Franz's decision, would not change easily. Have a safe trip, Franz. I will, mother. Franz left Vienna 3 days later. There was no railway between Vienna and Hungary, so Franz could only choose to take a boat. In addition to Thalia and Ajani, Franz was accompanied by Archduke Karol's eldest son, Archduke Albrecht. At that time diamonds were very valuable. Very valuable. Very valuable. Chapter 152 Pace Hotel. On the Danube, 4 Taffy family steamships were cutting through the calm water. Uncle Albrecht, are you going to Hungary too? To be honest, Franz was surprised to meet Archduke Albrecht on the ship. Why can't you go if you can go? But I'm very strange. Doesn't Mrs. Sophie know that Hungary is very dangerous now? There are hundreds of thousands of refugees, and riots may break out at any time. You might be kidnapped and become a hostage. Archduke Albrecht, the eldest son of Archduke Karol, was later a hero of the Italian War and was known as the last famous general of the Austrian Empire. Uncle Albrecht, I think it would be better to kidnap you. It would be more profitable that way. After all, Grandpa Karol is the richest man in our Austrian Empire. Little Franz, I'm not kidding. Your identity is very sensitive. If you plan to visit Hungary, I suggest you wait a few months before going. Riots are not fun, and many people may die. Uncle Albrecht, are you dressed like this to go to Hungary to take office? Albrecht was wearing his military uniform at this time. Only then did Franz realize a problem. Archduke Karl and his family seemed to be very interested in it. I like to wear military uniforms. Anyway, I'm also a colonel in the Austrian Empire. I think they will listen to me. Albrecht, who was tall and mighty, said this without confidence. In fact, the composition of the Austrian Imperial Army is very complex. It not only has the Imperial Army, but also the local defense forces. Hungary also has a separate organization, the Royal Army. Theoretically, all the armies of the Austrian Empire should be unified under the jurisdiction of the Imperial War Department during wartime. But in fact, in addition to the Imperial Army, the local defense forces and the Royal Army have very large autonomy. And Archduke Albrecht is a colonel of the Imperial Army, and the Royal Army in Hungary will most likely not accept his advice. But in fact, because he was a royal and the son of Carol, the Hungarian military treated him surprisingly well. Okay, Uncle Albrecht, but do you only have 2 guards? Didn't you only bring 2 nannies? Albrecht thought for a while and asked curiously, how do you know that I only brought 2 people? Because, except you 3, these 4 boats are all my people. It was already evening when we arrived in Budapest. The scene in front of him made Franz feel a little confused. Most of the buildings in the city that were destroyed by the storm had been rebuilt. The streets were clean and tidy, and there was no trace of the aftermath of the disaster. It was similar to any big city in the world at this time. The nobles lived a life of feasting and entertainment, while ordinary people were busy trying to survive. But one thing is very unusual, that is, there is no disaster victim at all. Generally speaking, disaster victims will consciously flock to big cities to seek shelter. This is an old tradition in the Austrian Empire. You must know that the streets and alleys of Vienna were filled with victims begging along the streets. If it were not for the flood, the slums of Vienna would have been overcrowded. According to intelligence reports, there are hundreds of thousands of people wandering around in Hungary at this time. However, as the core city of Hungary, there is not a single disaster victim here. It is too peaceful and strange. Archduke Albrecht took his 2 personal guards and hired a carriage directly to the military camp outside the city. Franz did not choose to live in the royal palace, but chose the very famous Pest Hotel in Hungary. This hotel, named after the city, has a very complex mix of guests and is also the largest information exchange center in the city. This hotel looks luxurious on the outside, but it is full of fireworks inside. The hotel lobby is more like a market than a restaurant. Looking around the entire first floor, there are messy tables and chairs and noisy crowds everywhere, as well as cheap drinks and even brought dry food. At this time, the people on the second floor were well dressed. Some people were smiling at the chaotic scene on the first floor. Some people were indifferently eating a sumptuous meal and changing glasses with others. In some private rooms, some secret activities were going on, or indescribable transactions. Although Franz had kept a low profile as much as possible, the waiter only took a glance and invited Franz to the second floor. Ajani is very familiar with this kind of place and completed the check-in procedure without much effort. Franz fell asleep. After all, a child might get nothing if he goes out to ask around. It is better to leave this kind of thing to professionals, and Franz's body will get sleepy at night. No point in this kind of place. No matter you are a dignitary, a passing businessman, or a common person, as long as you walk around inside, you can usually find some information that is useful to you, or at least you can gain a lot of knowledge. Of course, you can just listen to some words, but they may not be true. Some things are best left alone, because there is a price to pay for meddling. Thalia went to the first floor. Ajani wandered around the second floor, and Perish was secretly protected with a large group of guards. Several libertines tried to strike up a conversation with Ajani and Thalia, but gave up when they saw the top quality pigeon blood stones inlaid on the necklaces on the 2 girls' chests. Pigeon blood ruby. The most expensive type of ruby was often called burning blood in Europe at this time. Generally speaking, women who can wear such expensive jewelry are definitely not something that this group of people can afford to offend, and experienced veterans can easily spot the guards not far away, let alone take a trip into this muddy water. Soon a large amount of information came together. The price of food in this city had indeed been raised. It had exceeded the highest level of the Austrian Empire's price limit order and was twice the normal price. The Austrian Empire price limit order is 1.7 times, but this price is not enough to cause large-scale displacement. A series of public projects have indeed been built in Hungary. However, these projects were all done in the name of Count Zichenyi. There is no unified conclusion as to whether there is support from the Hungarian government. However, one thing is certain, all public projects in Hungary, put together do not reach the scale of 30 million florins. Most of the nobles in the city have received compensation, but the basis for this compensation is very strange. It does not depend on the severity of the disaster, but on the amount of property owned, and the level of the title point. The idea of rescuing officials first, before rescuing the people may still make sense in this era, but it makes people angry. If there is no reason for the victims, the Hungarian government has mobilized the royal army to guard Budapest and strictly control the inflow of victims. Other surrounding cities have done the same thing. In order to prevent the occurrence of riots, the victims have been concentrated in one area point. In addition to some food, fishing gear was also distributed to the victims, allowing them to fish to save themselves. Franz originally had reservations about teaching people how to fish, rather than teaching them how to fish point, but the actual situation taught Franz a lesson. That is, not only were the victims unable to catch fish, but many people fell into the raging Danube and died. The water of the Danube River is not only deep, but also flows extremely fast, and the location of fish schools is elusive. Unless you are a professional fisherman, it is difficult to make a living by fishing. The Danube is the deepest river in Europe and the third deepest in the world. Of course, there are also some gossips, such as the Polish Restoration Army preparing to rise in Budapest, Count Pilar's second son murdering his eldest brother, Count Széchenyi purchasing 1,000 serfs, etc. After listening to all the information, Franz came to only one conclusion. That is, the Hungarian government was rotten to the core. Chapter 153. The Rebel. The whole world is turbid, but I alone am pure. Everyone is drunk, but I alone am sober. The saint is not stagnant in things, but can move with the world. Everyone in the world is turbid. Why don't you clean up the mud and make waves? Everyone is drunk. Why don't you clean up the dregs and wipe off the dregs? You in Hungary. Pest Hotel. There are two paths before Franz now. One is to turn a blind eye, return directly to Vienna, and continue to plan his own world affairs. The second is to join in, participate in this decadent carnival, and continue to make money. The Hungarian government issued an announcement announcing that as long as refugees are between 14 and 25 years old, regardless of gender, and have passed the physical examination, they only need to pay 5 florins to apply for immigration. However, the number of places is limited each time. First come, first served. This all seems good and fair. However, Franz can tell what they want to do from the countries where they immigrated to: the United States, Texas, French colony, Brazil, and Argentina. The Hungarian government's final solution to the refugees seemed to Thalia and Ajani to be a very benevolent approach. Crossing the ocean to make a living in the 19th century was not uncommon, and many people had heard the legend of the promised land. Franz hoped that his guess was wrong, but it was very possible that things were different from what everyone thought. This is not a simple immigration, but a case of human trafficking. These Hungarians would be sold to the French colonies, and in the end everything they produced would become bullets fired at their fellow citizens in the Austrian Empire. At this time, the price of black slaves in the United States was approaching $600. Even the price of Indians had soared from $15 to $50. The price of white indentured slaves had naturally increased as well. The white slave trade has never been interrupted. Even after the decline of the Ottomans and the destruction of the Barbary pirates, the British used false contracts to trick Italian workers into coming to the UK. The contracts promised the Italian workers high wages and benefits, and they could choose to come back at any time. In fact, these contracts are not recognized by the UK at all. The workers who were deceived into the UK can only work endlessly under the whip of the supervisor. They do not even think about returning to their country until they are sick or lose the ability to work. He was kicked out of the factory and left on the corner of the street to die. At this time, refugees in Hungary could be sold for $100 to $150 each. There were nearly 300,000 refugees outside the city. Selling them to the Americas was definitely a considerable income. If you can sell half of it, you can earn a huge return of $15 million. The most terrifying thing about this move is that even if the whole thing is found out, it is legal. Even if it is made public, there is nothing wrong with it, except that it will make the Austrian Empire lose face point, because the Hungarian government can completely describe it as a labor export, rather than a slave trade point. If Franz tried to stop this, he might even be surrounded by angry victims. The most sensible thing to do now is to leave Hungary immediately, return to Vienna, pretend that nothing happened, and then wait for the opportunity. After all, it is not too late for a gentleman to take revenge in 10 years, and these scum will be completely liquidated in 1848. There is another way to choose to be a tyrant, by sweeping away the mud and making waves. Franz can naturally do what the Hungarians can do, and he can use his knowledge to do it better and better. This will not only weaken Hungary's strength, but also win a good reputation for benevolence, and make a lot of money to do more useful things. You can even get a group of Hungarians to colonize Africa, and then drive them back home after they finish construction. However, neither of these two paths is what Franz wants. Delayed justice is not real justice, and people's bottom line is often lower and lower. An ordinary person without a bottom line may live a happy life, but a person with a bottom line may live a happy life. If capable and powerful people have no bottom line, it will cause many people pain. This situation is not completely unsolvable. First, we must reduce the number of possible victims. Franz purchased a lot of land during the famine. Although many German immigrants were cultivating it, they still could not fully digest the land. Originally, Franz planned to continue attracting German immigrants, but he had to change his strategy and open the royal estate to absorb refugees. This was the most effective method. Just be careful that the proportion of Hungarians in the royal estate should not be too high. At the same time, neither the Germans nor the Hungarians should feel discriminated against. And for the sake of safety, it is not appropriate to put Hungarians into a royal family alone manner. Franz spent 7.5 million florins to purchase 3 million acres of wasteland in Hungary. At this time, only less than 300,000 acres were developed, and there were 120,000 German immigrants. After considering, there will be more German immigrants come to Austria. Hungarians can account for 50% of the royal estate, which means that Franz's estate can absorb up to 120,000 Hungarian refugees. There are still 180,000 refugees left. Franz can naturally hire them to reclaim wasteland, but even if he pays 50 florins per person, it will still cost 9 million florins. Plus other expenses, the total expenditure may be more than 12 million florins. However, the actual situation is that the price of food is twice as high as in the past, and 50 florins is not enough to support a farmer's life for a year. The land that farmers have just reclaimed is not profitable, and the crops in the land cannot even make a living in the coming year. Therefore, Franz needs much more than 12 million florins. Just to get these farmers through the difficulties will require 20 million florins. Franz still needs the second step, which is to crack down on speculators who are driving up prices. If this matter is left to the Hungarian government, I'm afraid it will end up in nothing, and the Austrian Imperial government cannot reach out to Hungary. Facing this group of shameless people, Franz could only use magic to defeat magic. Franz could import grain from Russia and sell it to the poor in Hungary at a low price. Although he would suffer some losses, he would not be starved to death. Or he could buy grain in Hungary at double the price and let those unscrupulous businessmen make a profit. It's still much better to have a bowl full of it. As long as enough profit margins are left for the Tsar, the food agreement between Russia and the United States will be a piece of waste paper. Moreover, the food crisis has reached its final stage, and high food prices cannot continue forever. Therefore, the Tsar would not let go of this good opportunity to make money. Russia was too poor. It is true that goods imported into the Austrian Empire through Hungary had to pay customs duties, but the royal family was not among them. Although Franz had offended the entire Hungarian aristocracy by doing this, he didn't care. He cares more about his own mood than those bullshit nobles in Hungary. In order to make the traffickers give up, Franz decided to send people to infiltrate the ranks of the indentured slaves at the same time. In order to ensure that those traffickers would die thoroughly, he also roped in the church and nobles in Vienna's aristocratic circle. There are many people who like to seek death. The exciting thing of pretending to be a slave being sold to America will naturally attract a lot of neurotics. As for the church, it hated the trafficking of Christians. coupled with Archbishop Rorschach's relationship, a group of devout clergy was soon arranged. After Archduke Albrecht heard about Franz's plan, he also volunteered. His joining would definitely make the deaths of those traffickers even worse. The Mid-Autumn Festival is approaching, and I wish all book friends a happy Mid-Autumn Festival. Chapter 154 Death Upon Death. Austria's royal estates had an unparalleled attraction for farmers, because entering the royal estate meant being exempted from all exorbitant taxes. As long as you pay enough of the royal rations, the rest will be yours. As the saying goes, the more you work, the more you will get. The excess grain can be converted into money, and the housekeeper who comes to the city can help carry the goods, or you can follow the housekeeper out to the city to purchase. Pretending to be a rich man. Children can attend primary school for free, families can receive free medical treatment, there is an independent chapel, and they can go hunting and picnicking during leisure time. Watching the sunrise and sunset, watching the children grow up day by day, enjoying the tranquility of the years in the homemade armchair, until one day he passed away peacefully. However, in fact, this was only true during the decades of peace that relied on the Metternich system to maintain the Austrian Empire after the Napoleonic Wars in the past. Every time there was a war, the peasants on the royal estate had to perform military service or pay for the service. Generally speaking, no one wants to die on the battlefield, so farmers do not dare to spend their money randomly, and they save it to pay for the service. Even those fanatics who admire the Habsburg family very much must get themselves good equipment when they go to the battlefield. An excellent rifle made in a large blacksmith shop usually costs 100 to 200 florins, and mass production bulk goods only cost 20 to 30 florins. Dagger, bayonet, ammunition box, kettle, matchbox, tent, blanket, raincoat, military boots, chainmail, cross, flagon, sewing box, and a mule or horse. Even so, the peasants in the royal estate still lived a better and more dignified life than the peasants outside. After the royal estate announced that it would accept refugees, not only did a large number of refugees try to join, but the poor and homeless in the city also tried to fish in troubled waters. In order to avoid bringing some of the dregs of society into his manor, Franz could only add some restrictions, that is, women and children were given priority. After all, these people belonged to a vulnerable group. At the same time, it is unrealistic to allow these vulnerable groups to participate in land reclamation, and these people are also the easiest group of people to assimilate. Labor for land reclamation requires strong people, and these people need to be treated with caution. Unlike the German immigrants, who left their hometowns, they are more susceptible to the influence of radical ideas. Once these people riot, not only will Franz's efforts be in vain, but also more it will bring disrepute to the royal family. The remaining elderly people can only send them to workhouses or let them work at the lowest level. Of course, they are not city cleaners or excrement collectors. There are still many people competing for such jobs. The only jobs left for the victims are bone pickers, dog shit pickers, rag pickers, mud diggers, ditch pickers, river walkers, and shore walkers. This kind of job sounds incredible. River people usually carry a 3 to 4 meter long wooden stick and rummage through the mud on the river beach for some valuable items. They usually wear large coats with very large pockets so that they can hold more of scrap metal. They are usually accompanied by 1 or 2 less strong companions, called mud diggers, who rummage at the feet of the river people for garbage that others look down upon, such as coal, ropes, and relatively complete pieces of wood. People on the shore wait for someone to drown, or a floating corpse, to pass by, before they can do business. There is usually no business for many days, but one business can often feed them for several months or even half a year. Bone pickers collect the carcasses of various animals in cities and surrounding areas, while dog poop men collect the feces of various animals. Although Franz's approach could not absorb all the refugees immediately, it at least gave them hope. Ajani also successfully penetrated into the human traffickers and collected a large amount of criminal evidence. At the same time, she also found out the biggest buyer, who was indeed a Frenchman. The French ordered 3,000 Hungarian laborers in one fell swoop, who would be sent to the port of Houston. Each living white slave can be sold for 800 francs, and a female slave can be sold for 1,200 francs. If you can speak French and English, the price can be increased. At this time in the book, $1 equals 4 francs. The Tsar was ecstatic when he learned that his next door neighbor was going to buy grain from his own country and transport it to Hungary for sale, because he knew that this behavior would undoubtedly add fuel to the Allies' fragile internal relations. As a neighbor, the Tsar was naturally very willing to see this result. As for the agreement with the Americans, he threw it behind him, not to mention that the country had too much food to eat. Selling it to Austria would not only make profits, but also by disrupting the other party's internal relations to weaken it, killing two birds with one stone. Why not? Russian grains arrived in Budapest one by one along the Danube River, which made Hungarian profiteers completely lose their temper and could only sell grains like crazy. Some people also tried to introduce Russian grains into Vienna, but after adding tariffs, it became a loss-making business. Someone tried to destroy the place to scare away these outsiders, but after the destruction, they discovered that it was the property of the royal family. Not only would they be exiled from the country, but their family property would also be confiscated to compensate for the royal family's losses. Of course, the Hungarians would not let Franz act so recklessly. Letters reporting and condemning Franz were thrown into the Hofburg Palace like snowflakes. Hofburg Palace, Hall of Mirrors. My stupid brother, look at what good things your son has done. How can he inherit this country in the future if he looks like this? My poor brother, why do you think it was my son who did it and not me? He is just a child. My stupid brother, didn't you say he was a genius? My poor brother, how can you believe what a fool says? Ferdinand I was speechless, paused and continued, my stupid brother, in this case, I have no choice but to ground you. My poor brother, how can I hunt? You can't be so cruel to your brother. My stupid brother, why don't you stop drinking? Then, I'd better ground myself. Hungarian immigrants boarded the so-called immigration boats in the port of Trieste, but there were only 4 small boats with 3,000 people. These ships were the most commonly used by slave traders. They were fast and had a large loading capacity. Usually hundreds of people would be packed onto the deck. When it rained, they would be covered with a rubberized canvas. This simple cabin is also called a living hell. However, those brainwashed Hungarian refugees were willing to endure this humiliation and pain, and boarded the ship one after another, in order to reach the new world of their dreams. Of course, Franz would not let them do this. After all, there were some big shots mixed in. They were just here to experience the suffering of the people, not to risk their lives. So the Austrian Imperial Navy suddenly appeared and seized the ship on the grounds that it was overloaded. After the Hungarian government sent people to negotiate, the Austrian Navy decided to send ships to help. At first, the Hungarian government was very happy. After all, it even saved transportation costs. After a month of wandering, Hungarian victims finally arrived in Houston Point after the Austrian Imperial Navy left the shore. The French slave traders came to pick up the goods in accordance with the agreement in the contract. Soon the victims understood that the other party was not an intermediary at all, but a slave trader. What was even more frightening was that they were sold, and the money was returned. Not in your own hands. Chapter 155 Death upon Death. Someone tried to escape, but was immediately knocked down by a slave trader and whipped. These slave traders are very experienced. They know how to beat them without damaging the goods and making these people obedient. These Hungarians soon fell into despair. They went through all kinds of hardships and abandoned their wives and children. Unexpectedly, they ended up becoming white slaves. Someone started crying quietly, and soon the crying spread like a plague among the crowd. It's so funny. How dare you call yourself a fighting nation? A slave said disdainfully in German. Soon some slaves began to talk in German. These German-speaking slaves looked very interested, as if they were not slaves, but a group of tourists watching a performance in a circus. Tell them to shut up, a slave trader leader said impatiently to his subordinates. He hated white slaves the most, because they had a lot of trouble, either crying or making trouble, and here came a group of lunatics. It's just that the Hungarian officials who were dealing with them were scared out of their wits. These people in front of them not only spoke German, but also the German Viennese dialect, spoken by the upper class in Austria, not the dialect of the previous German slaves. Kill them quickly, quickly. The Hungarian official shouted hysterically, but was kicked down by the leader on the side. Damn it, don't buy Hungarian slaves next time, they're all fucking crazy. Then he looked at his men. What are you still doing? Use whips and sticks. A slave trader whipped the slave who was talking the most happily, but to his surprise, his hand was grabbed by another tall slave in midair. Let go. Damn it. Let go of your hand. The slave trader kept roaring in shock and anger. However, the tall slave had no intention of letting go. Instead, he increased the force on his hand, and the whip in the slaver's hand fell with a sound. The tall slave then kicked the slave trader in the abdomen, kicking the latter's entire body off the ground. However, the slave trader leader watched with interest. He admired the big man in front of him. At this time, a game in which slaves fought to the death was popular in North America. To put it simply, 2 or more slaves are locked together and watch them fight to the death for fun, just like the gladiators in ancient Rome. The winner wins everything, while the loser loses everything. There are many names for this game, including Mandingo in Django Saved, Alabama Wrestling, or the Hercules game. Participants could be black or Indian, and some white people were also forced to participate. An excellent Mandingo man can even be sold for tens of thousands of dollars, and the white slave in front of him completely meets this standard. He is tall and ruthless. He can kill people with one blow, and can definitely make a lot of money. The tall man's name was Buckway, a guard of the Taffy family and a nobleman. The mean German slave was Edward Taffy's cousin Simon Taffy, an idle man who liked to seek excitement of nobility. Pretending to be a slave and crossing the ocean was not the craziest thing Simon had ever done. He once paid a reward for himself, just to test whether his home was safe. Buckway had long been accustomed to his master's crazy behavior. He put his foot on the slave's head and spoke in French. "Aren't you coming to save him?" The slave trader leader was not angry at Buckway's provocation, but asked calmly, "Do you want to make a lot of money? Aren't you here just to make money? I guarantee you can make money here that you can't make in your whole life in Europe." "I don't want to." Buckway directly threw the half-dead slave trader out. The leader of the trader was knocked down on the spot. Before he could dodge, he shouted loudly, "Hit me. Beat him until he surrenders." Dozens of slave traders rushed towards the crowd and beat everyone with whips and wooden sticks. However, the white slaves were no longer afraid and instead fought with the slave traders. Seeing that the dozens of slave traders were about to be beaten to death by the white slaves, several more slave traders rushed over with guns. "Stop it, otherwise I'll shoot." But before the man could finish speaking, he was shot in the head. There were several people with guns among the slaves. When they saw that the other party was about to take action, they directly drew their guns and shot, because they knew that Archduke Albrecht was still there. If the other party acted recklessly and something happened, they could bear it. Sorry. Albrecht was still blocked by the guards at this time, and could only shout, "Charge! Kill! Fight them!" The slave traders had few guns, and were defenseless. The other side made a sneak attack. Plus each of them had 2 new Colt revolvers, and they were also veterans who had experienced hundreds of battles. The battle went without any suspense, and soon a dozen slave traders with guns were shot dead. The leader who fell on the ground and the crowd fighting together were all frightened, because the situation reversed twice in a split second, which made people a little confused. Dozens of royal guards began to sweep the battlefield and occupy the manor, and the slave traders were tied together. The leader of the slave traders sneered and said, "No matter who you are, if you dare to destroy our place, you are all dead. The French gendarmes will be here soon." At this time, the little boss was speaking English, which most people present could not understand. Albrecht understood. He stepped forward and slapped the opponent with a big mouth, making stars appear in his eyes. "Who ordered you?" The little leader pointed to the big house next to him. Albrecht waved his hand, and a group of royal guards and Austrian officers rushed into the big house. At this time, the Hungarian government commissioner was also captured. The angry Hungarian white slaves almost tore him apart, but Albrecht stopped him, just in time. "Please explain the ins and outs of this matter and let everyone hear who was involved." I. The special correspondent became a little slurred because of fright. Albrecht didn't have a good temper, so he simply took out the notebook given to him by Franz and handed it to the Hungarian commissioner. Read. Whatever is missing, whatever is missing, you can add it yourself. If your confessions are different, I don't recommend handing you over to your people. I believe they will be very willing to tear you into pieces. The commissioner's body was already stained with water, and he could only cry and talk. Albrecht also gave him a promise, as long as you tell everything clearly, I can send you and your family to a place where no one else can find you. The special correspondent naturally knew Archduke Albrecht, and he also knew that he was doomed and could only fight once for a chance of survival. But, Grand Duke Albrecht, how are you going to go back? This is French territory. Oh, don't worry about this, you'll know it soon. At this time, the whistle sounded, and the fleet of the Austrian Imperial Navy returned. Navy Commander Archduke Friedrich stood on the bow of the ship and said to his newly formed Marine Corps, "Bring my eldest brother and my compatriots in Austria back. If anyone stops us, don't be polite. We will arrest them all and bring them back to China." White slaves, officials suspected of slave trading, slave traders, and witnesses were all brought back to the country by Friedrich. Ask for votes. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 156, The Punishment of Incompetence. This is exactly what the saying goes. If it were just an ordinary kidnapping case or a human trafficking case, it would not shock the entire top level of the Austrian Empire. But when these cases involve nobles and the royal family, their nature is completely different. Count Korolaf and Prince Metternich took it together and decided to hand over these cases to Archduke Karol. Although Archduke John was more famous than Archduke Karol, the former had given up his royal status at this time and was more like a peacemaker in personality. This matter involves the royal family, and two of the Grand Dukes are the sons of Archduke Karol. By handing this matter over to Archduke Karol, one is to satisfy the nobles of Vienna, the other is to give an explanation to the subjects of the Austrian Empire, and the third is to force the Hungarian government to hand over the matter quickly. Regarding this matter, Prince Metternich originally planned to strictly block the news. However, what was helpless was that this mighty team had already spread the news. After landing in Venice and all the way to Vienna. Everyone from Italy to Moravia is talking about this matter. Even the imperialists in Croatia are shouting to seek justice for the royal family. Transylvania is even more worried about the chaos in the world. The serfs in Galicia even wanted to raise troops to serve the king immediately. When the news reached Hungary, the nobles and officials involved in the slave trade felt as if the sky was falling and the earth was falling. Originally, if the Hungarians signed a slave agreement with the Texas slave traders, the matter could be passed off in the name of labor export. The problem is that the Hungarian government and nobles also want to save face. They are clearly said to be immigrants, but they become indentured slaves. This will definitely attract a lot of criticism. So the Hungarian nobles, who wanted both face and money, chose to take a desperate risk and transported the refugees directly to Texas, handing this hot potato to the slave traders. But before those slave traders could threaten or induce them, they were caught off guard by the royal guards and noble bodyguards mixed among the refugees. This matter involved both people and the Austrian imperial family. And even the French were unwilling to wade into this muddy water, claiming that the person who did it was an American from Texas and a Protestant. The trafficking of Christians also caused an uproar in France. People, churches and even nobles protested, forcing the French government to reiterate that France will always be a filial son of the Catholic Church and will never engage in slave trading. What the Hungarian nobles want to do most now is to find the Jew who has been giving them bad ideas. But the cunning Jewish businessman has long since disappeared, and a group of noble bodyguards can only be furious. In fact, Franz also wanted to meet someone who could come up with such a vicious plan and bring together this group of arrogant nobles in Hungary. It was a pity that the Jewish businessman had friendship with the Rothschild family. And the news of Solomon Rothschild was faster than the courier of the Austrian Empire. This Jewish businessman was a descendant that Solomon admired very much. Solomon even predicted that he would achieve great success, but at this time he had to choose to flee. The young man fled to the Ottoman Empire under the pseudonym Saurus. This was also his first encounter with Franz and the Austrian Empire. The Hungarian side originally wanted to find a few people to take over, but this was what Franz had expected, and the interrogation of the slave traders and the Hungarian government commissioner was completed on the road. The secret police also visited Hungary, and batches of seemingly insignificant people were secretly arrested and interrogated. Many nobles observed the interrogation, and the results of the interrogation made people angry. This transaction did not just start today, but has been ongoing. In the past 10 years, at least 50,000 Hungarians have been trafficked. This time the planners originally planned to play a big game, so they roped in many nobles as their protective umbrella. However, this plan was disrupted by the sudden appearance of the royal family. In the end, the plan had to be temporarily changed. In order to have enough money and avoid the refugees' regret, they did not sign a slave agreement before boarding the ship, but chose to transfer the white slaves directly. Sold to Texans. The sudden decrease in profits caused dissatisfaction among the Hungarian nobles, and the planners had to find ways to increase profits. There are only two ways to increase profits. One is to raise prices. At this time, no one around the world is interested in the white slave trade. The main reason is that the profits are not high and the goods are in trouble. The second is to reduce costs. The price of indentured slaves is obviously not worth that of white slaves without freedom. Moreover, once the indentured slaves accidentally gain freedom and return to the Austrian Empire, it will be a devastating blow to the reputation of the Hungarian government and nobles. The entire layout is almost seamless, allowing those Hungarians who were sold out to be grateful to their government. Not only that, it can also solve the refugee crisis and prevent the Austrian army from taking the opportunity to enter Hungary. It can be said that it kills three birds with one stone. And this planner can make a lot of money. But now the Hungarian nobles have to face the wrath of the entire Austrian Empire, including even their own compatriots. The Hungarian government's subcontracting behavior made the Austrian Imperial government even more outraged. The entire case involved 570 members of 136 Hungarian families. The Habsburg royal family had always been benevolent and naturally would not go on a killing spree. However, the 5 principal culprits had to be exiled, and the remaining 565 people paid a fine of 10,000 florins each. This punishment can be said to be very light, but it still makes many Hungarian nobles hold a grudge. Kossuth, who was in prison, even shouted that this was a violation of Hungarian law. The Austrian Empire must pay the price for its stupid actions. The future of the Hungarians is at hand. There were many people who had the same idea as Kossuth, and they even organized demonstrations to protest against the atrocities of the Austrians at this time in Hungary. No matter what the Austrian Empire did, or how it did it, it would be regarded by the other party as interfering in internal affairs and undermining its independence. However, this time the great nobles of Hungary did not participate, because they knew that the punishment this time was already very light, and at the same time, the entire noble circle of the Austrian Empire had some opinions on Hungary. If it were the past, at least the Bohemian nobles would stand on Hungary's side, but this time the Hungarians obviously went too far, and even the Bohemian nobles did not bother to stand on their side. What is needed at this time is to be patient, rather than jumping out and continuing to fight the empire. Franz had already anticipated the weakness of the Austrian imperial government, but he did not expect it to be so decadent. Fortunately, Franz had already prepared generous gifts for the extreme Democrats in Hungary, and the clergymen on the ship were not going to the theater. The news soon reached Rome, and Pope Gregory XVI immediately announced the excommunication of 570 Hungarians involved in the slave trade. At the same time, he once again declared that the church would never tolerate or condone the trafficking of Christians, and recommended the Austrian imperial government impartially judges those who deserve their crimes. As a result, some extreme religious figures launched an assassination operation against the slave traders. The streets almost turned into battlefields, and the killings on both sides quickly exceeded the bottom line. Count Zhny watched the killings on the streets with concern. He did not understand why Hungary had become like this. Franz had no interest in this kind of low-level killing. What he wanted was the redefinition and legislative protection of the slave trade in the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire announced a new anti-slave trade bill, which classified the illegal export of labor as slave trafficking. At the same time, it made some regulations on the wages and treatment of foreign labor. Anything that failed to meet the standards was regarded as human trafficking. In the end, Hungary had to accept the new bill, but this did not satisfy everyone. Chapter 157 Steam Turbine. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. The brothers Albrecht and Friedrich didn't seem to be in a very high mood, drinking sullenly without saying a word. In fact, Franz was also unhappy. Although legislative protection could reduce the slave trade to a certain extent, the punishment was too light. The accomplices had 10,000 florins each, the principals 50,000 florins each, and the real mastermind was at large. The Austrian Empire confiscated a total of 5.9 million florins from Hungarian human traffickers. This money will be handed over to the Hungarian government for use in the compensation of victims and relief for disaster victims. Hungarian speaker Bilal was forced to resign, along with nearly 100 officials involved. At the same time, 17 Hungarian officials who were directly involved were dismissed. The Austrian Empire would send officials to Hungary to oversee relief and pension efforts. Archduke Karol did not make a big fuss in Hungary as everyone expected, but just went through the motions in Budapest. When he came back, he gave the brothers Albrecht and Friedrich a lesson and scolded them for their nonsense. With the resignation of a large number of Hungarian officials, the entire region fell into chaos. A large number of horse bandits appeared in the local area, and even the royal estates were attacked. Franz was certain that these attacks were organized and purposeful, and ordinary gangsters would not dare to attack the royal estate. It was not easy to hide on the Hungarian plains, but their mischief was actually a favor to Franz. Franz had always wanted to transport weapons into Hungary, and this time he had an honest reason. Now all parties are dissatisfied with this result, so some people will be impatient. I have a newly invented dessert here, almond tofu. Do you want to try it? Albrecht was not interested in eating, but Friedrich was open-minded. Since there was no result, he might as well do something else. So he happened to be hungry and said, "What is tofu? You can also get almonds this season. You are really good." Friedrich said. The preservation and storage technology at this time was very poor, and even the emperor could only taste the almonds during their ripening season. Hence the famous saying, "I want to eat dumplings." However, preserving almonds was too simple for Franz, but making tofu took a lot of effort from Franz. "Thank you for the compliment, Uncle Friedrich. I have another gift for you." After Franz finished speaking, he handed Friedrich a drawing, and the latter studied it for a long time. "Isn't this a steam engine? But the parameters are too high, right? Didn't some scientist study it while drunk?" Friedrich has been immersed in military technology for many years. He doesn't think there is anything he doesn't know. Power machinery. This is called a steam turbine. It's much more efficient than the current reciprocating steam engine. It's normal that you can't understand it. The best steam engine now has a thermal efficiency of only 8%, but this guy's thermal efficiency can easily exceed 40%. Even if more advanced reciprocating steam is invented in the future, the maximum efficiency cannot exceed 20%, but the steam turbine is completely different. With the steam turbine, the maximum efficiency can go up to 80%. To this day, American aircraft carriers are still driven by this thing, which shows how powerful it is, the driving force. What's even more terrible is that the steam turbine has a simple structure, small footprint, lighter, quieter, low manufacturing cost, long service life, low failure rate, easy maintenance, and countless other advantages. Historically, the emergence of steam turbines killed reciprocating steam engines almost instantly. However, there is now a problem, that is, insufficient rubber. Mr. Doppler tried to use eucommia gum instead. As a result, there was a problem with the tightness and a violent explosion occurred. This led to the suspension of classes at the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna for a month. The entire laboratory was blown up on the spot. Fortunately, there were no casualties, but it caused huge losses to the reputation of the college. Many aristocratic families refused to send their children back to school. They would rather hire teachers from the Holy See to teach than let their children stay in this dangerous place even for one more minute. At the same time, a large number of noble families who could not afford dowries sent their children over, and in the end the number of people in the college increased. Enrollment at the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna is not going smoothly. Currently, there are no students in the high school or university departments. Most of the people who come to class are little Lalita, and they are generally pampered. This place is more like a kindergarten than a college. The junior high school is a group of young women. They often have nothing to do after getting married, or they are victims of unfortunate marriages. One word can best describe it, which is the complaint center. They have talked about the bad things of the parents in Vienna. In addition to the two compulsory courses of mathematics and German, the popularity of housework and communication courses has skyrocketed. Some people have signed up for literature and theology, while history and law courses are empty. As for physics and chemistry, no one is interested at all. That's why Doubler and a group of physicists had time to conduct experiments. Regarding this steam turbine, all participants understood that this would be an invention that transcended the times, and at the same time they also felt a very serious sense of frustration. Archduke Franz was just 9 years old, but his vision and wisdom seemed to have surpassed all the geniuses present. 40%? Friedrich looked a little unbelievable. Yes, with this guy, your warship can easily break through 30 knots, and then the British and French warships can only follow you and eat dust. There is no ashes in the sea. Thalia whispered. Your elbows are turned outward, right? You are really a bad girl in college. What do you, the principal, mean by following me around all day? Franz pinched Thalia's butt, and the latter could only stand up straight and endure it. After all, there were other members of the royal family present. If Thalia knocked off Franz's hand like usual, it would probably cause unnecessary trouble. Jenny saw something wrong with Friedrich's eyes and coughed twice to remind Franz. Franz then turned his head and saw Friedrich staring at him angrily. You damn kid, you're such a waste of money. Franz could only smile awkwardly, not knowing whether he was referring to the steam turbine or Thalia. This design is still in the experimental stage. I will hand it over to you when it is stable. This will definitely become a secret weapon of the Austrian Imperial Navy. Friedrich was angry and didn't want to speak, but Albrecht hit him on the head. Be polite and remember who you are. The lineage of Archduke Karol can only be regarded as a collateral line at this time, and it is no surprise that Franz will inherit the position of patriarch in the future. So whether they are ministers of the Austrian Empire or members of the family, they should maintain respect for the future monarch. The 185cm Archduke Albrecht felt a strong sense of oppression against the 158cm Archduke Friedrich, who could only bow his head and admit his mistake. Uncle Albrecht, don't worry. Sooner or later, those Hungarians will lose their temper. At that time, I will find a way to let you vent your anger in person. Chapter 158 Congreve Rocket. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Albrecht shrugged, not denying Franz's abilities. It's just that the imperial government, the royal family, and the church didn't do anything to those Hungarians. What can Franz, a little devil, do? Why don't you tell me what good stuff your kid has? Judging from your proud look, you must have something good, right? Franz took out a large sky monkey and the two brothers on the other side said in unison, Congreve rocket. Yes, the potential of this weapon is huge, but it has not been discovered yet. The origin of the Congreve rocket should be the flying crow of the Ming dynasty, which was later imitated by the Indians and made into the Indian giant eagle. After being modified by the Indians, the rocket is more powerful and has a longer range, up to 2.5 kilometers. Later, during the invasion of India, the British were badly beaten by this kind of rocket, so the British took the captured objects back to the country for research and modification. The engineer responsible for modifying the rocket was Major William Congreve. After 5 years of research, he finally created a weapon that could adapt to the European battlefield. The Congreve rocket weighs 14.5 kilograms, has an arrow length of 1.06 meters, a diameter of 0.1 meters, and is equipped with a 4.6 meter long balance rod, with a range of up to 1,800 Meters later, they showed their prowess in the Battle of 1807. The British Army launched 25,000 Congreve rockets into Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, within 10 hours. It not only ruined the Danish navy, but also almost burned the city to death. The Austrians recognized the potential of this weapon back then, but the British, as their allies, were unwilling to share their secrets with the Austrian Empire. Ever since, the Austrian military, with its clever thinking, turned its attention to Denmark, the victim of this weapon, and tried to get the secret of this weapon from the victim. What is surprising is that at this time the Danes not only cracked the secret of the Congreve rocket, but even created a lighter and more powerful version. In order to obtain the Congreve rocket, Foreign Minister Metternich promised the Danes that he would give Denmark political support at the Vienna peace conference. However, the Danes were unwilling to provide drawings, and only sent their designers to provide verbal guidance to the Austrian engineers, but for the Austrian engineers, that was enough. Vincent Augustin, the Austrian engineer responsible for building the Congreve rocket, achieved mass production of the Congreve rocket within 2 months after the Napoleonic Wars. This weapon gradually faded out of people's sight. Only Austria and Denmark were still enthusiastic about this weapon. At this time, the Austrian Empire ranked first in the world in rocket technology, but its stock was limited, and was mainly equipped for the navy, to fight against pirates within the Austrian Imperial military. Evaluations of the Congreve rocket are polarized. One side is represented by Marshal Radetzky. These generals feel that the Congreve rocket is simply a weapon given to the Austrian Empire by God. The Austrian Empire has a large number of cavalry, and its army is also known for its high mobility. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, due to the sharp rise in the status of artillery, the Austrian army became increasingly dependent on it. Especially during marches or offensive battles, infantry often need to slow down, to wait for the heavy weapons to arrive on the battlefield. This causes the Austrian army to lose its mobility advantage, and at the same time lags behind the French in artillery technology army, which led to a complete rout. The Austrians themselves concluded at the time that they did not feel that they could not defeat the French. They only felt that there was a gap in tactics and weapons, although the Congreve rocket is available in 4 models: 6 pounds, 12 pounds, 16 pounds and 28 pounds. They are all within the range acceptable to the soldiers' bodies. This kind of weapon can be distributed to the company to carry out mobile combat with the infantry or cavalry. At the same time, the Congreve rocket's rate of fire and range are much stronger than the artillery of the same period. The other side was represented by Prince Wendigratz and General Reich, who felt that the Congreve rocket was just nonsense. The leftover garbage that Easterners played hundreds of years ago can only be used to attack cities, and is very inhumane. At the same time, it is also criticized for its accuracy. The hit rate of this weapon is really impressive, even better than that of a musket. Someone once used 100 Congreve rockets to try to destroy a house 200 meters away. As a result, all 100 Congreve rockets missed. General Leakey even attributed his failure in Italy entirely to this weapon. In fact, General Reich's rocket force was together with the artillery, preparing to provide cover for the infantry in front. I don't know whether it was a technical problem or a matter of luck. More than 100 Congreve rockets directly hit the advancing Austrian troops' 3rd Infantry Regiment of Udine. Not only did it cause hundreds of casualties, it also caused the complete collapse of the 3rd Infantry Regiment of Udine and let go of the Carbonari rebels. The Navy was also not interested in this weapon, although the British once used it to almost destroy the entire Copenhagen. However, the lethality of Congreve rockets in naval battles is extremely limited, especially since the distance between the two sides in most naval battles exceeds 300 meters. At this distance, even when facing a target as big as a battleship, the hit rate of Congreve rockets is very low. In addition, the climate at sea is far worse than on land. Whether it is rain or storm, Congreve rockets will cause. Congreve rockets are ineffective, and sometimes the Congreve rockets are blown by the wind and change direction, or even fly towards one's own ships. Moreover, all the major powers in the world, including Britain, France, Russia, and even Prussia, have given up research on the Congreve rocket. The only countries that are obsessed with research and manufacturing it are Denmark and Austria, which is enough to prove that it is not a mainstream weapon. The Austrian Empire money and manpower should not be wasted continuing to develop this equipment. What? Good thing. Gunpowder is a good thing. Orientals use it to make firecrackers, and you use it to make congreve rockets. Friedrich said sarcastically, Franz, I advise you not to have too high expectations for this thing. Its rate of fire and range are very good, but its hit rate is terrible. It often flies around. Who will it hit? Even the person who launched it doesn't know. Albrecht had personally used this weapon. As a result, the congreve rocket, probably due to too much charge, detached from the launcher and flew towards everyone's heads. After the explosion, countless small iron beads flew out, but there was no causing casualties. In fact, congreve rockets have 3 types of warheads, namely high explosive bombs, shotguns, and incendiary bombs. However, the military usually uses incendiary bombs because the direction of such weapons is uncontrollable. If the explosion distance exceeds 5 meters, it is basically difficult to cause harm to people. Don't worry, I'm here to help you solve the hit rate problem. Although it's not a real solution, at least you won't let this kind of rocket fly back and hurt your own people. Franz pointed to the tail fin on the rocket. What is this? It seems to be the tail feathers on a bow and arrow. Friedrich said, you don't mistake it for a bow and arrow, do you? Albrecht asked. Is there any difference? With the addition of the tail fin, the rocket can remain relatively stable in the air and avoid excessive deflections. Isn't improving the hit rate exactly what the military needs now? Franz answer. Chapter 159 Morale. Of course, considering that the Austrian military does not have a large budget, it can be put into use directly, as long as a simple tail fin is added to the original design. The previously produced congreve rocket will not be wasted, and prefabricated fragments will be engraved to strengthen it. Power prefabricated fragments are made by carving grooves on the projectile body, or directly sticking special hard metal sheets to the projectile body. When the projectile explodes, the impact force is used to intensify the damage to surrounding targets. Historically, the Austrian Empire's research on rockets did not last long, and the rocket troops that were ordered in critical situations during the Battle of Sedan did not play a role in turning the tide. Point after that, rockets faded out of people's sight. It was not until World War I that the Austro-Hungarian Empire lacked firepower during its confrontation with Russia. Soldiers found these dusty weapons in the basement of the arsenal point, but it did not improve the situation of the war. Instead, it was taken by Russia, who invented the Katyusha rocket launcher and beat the Third Reich. In a sense, the Austrians also avenged Sedova. Not only the Austrians, but also the mainstream of the world's military circles at that time put accuracy first. However, as long as the power was sufficient and the number was sufficient, it didn't matter whether the attack was accurate or not. In the worst case, they would use ground washing tactics. It's just that artillery doctrine is still a bit too advanced for people of this era. Franz, if your modification is indeed effective, then we can let the rocket force concentrate its firepower and then make a little breakthrough. Maybe we will go back to the era of column tactics. Albrecht said, brother, if the other party also has this kind of weapon, wouldn't the column tactic be a recipe for death? If hundreds of rockets are fired at it, not to mention the flesh and blood of the soldiers, not even the battleship can bear it. Friedrich retorted. In 1827, the Austrian Navy launched a surprise attack on the Barbary pirates, anchored in a Moroccan port, using 500 congreve rockets to directly destroy the pirates' flagship and 2 capital ships. With the continuous upgrading of weapon firepower, concentrating troops together in the future will be courting death. As Grandpa Carroll judged, the future will be the era of skirmishes, and dense formations will be completely eliminated. Franz said, the skirmish formation can certainly reduce casualties, but how to ensure the morale of the soldiers? I think you should know that even my father admits that as long as there is no restraint from the platoon leader, the soldiers in the queue will immediately turn around and run away. Albrecht said, and the skirmishers have a natural enemy, which is the cavalry. Even the most experienced warriors cannot maintain a stable hit rate when facing the high-speed charging cavalry. The skirmishers in Napoleon's army at that time, regardless of personal quality and discipline, sex and morale, are among the best in Europe, but they still can't deal with serfs on horses. Friedrich added. Riding serf is a derogatory term for the Russian Cossack cavalry. Europeans generally believe that the Russian cavalry lacks quality, has no tactics, and is nothing but brutal point. Although the Russian Cossack cavalry won the victory in the end, they actually lost more than they won against the French cuirassiers. However, they almost never failed when attacking elite French skirmishers or chasseurs. Low morale is due to lack of faith. They don't know why they are fighting. To deal with the cavalry, you need rapid fire weapons. If a soldier can fire more than 3 bullets in the 10 seconds when the cavalry rushes in front of him, there is no need to panic. Yet, faith. Everyone in our country believes in Catholicism. Do you mean to eliminate the Protestants in the Austrian Empire? Friedrich said. It's just that Friedrich and Albrecht didn't look good after saying that, because their mother and sister were Protestants, and due to the Austrian Empire's religious freedom policy and the impact of joining the German Zollverein, the army now came from the north. There are not many Protestants in Germany. I'm not talking about religious belief, but faith in this country and this empire, Franz said. The soldiers of our empire only believe in 2 things. One is Catholicism, and the other is the family, referring to the Habsburg family. As for the imperial government and many local governments, they have hostile relations. In addition, you have not seen those Hungarians. What he did. Albrecht said, I'm just talking about the solution. I also know that this cannot be solved in the short term, but with education and publicity, there is still a way to make most people believe this. Franz said, compared to those useless sermons, I think money is more convincing. As long as those soldiers are given 3 times their wages, even the most cowardly people will dare to fight. Friedrich's tone was indifferent. Obviously he had done it experimental. The treatment and status of soldiers must be improved, but they cannot be maintained by money alone. Wouldn't that make them mercenaries? Franz has always scorned mercenaries due to his inherent modern thinking. Albrecht said at this time, the current country's military recruitment system is an extension of mercenaries. I also like volunteers. They have strong combat effectiveness, obey orders, rarely flee, and even bring their own weapons and dry food. But if there is a real war, how many such soldiers can we have? How many times will it be beaten? And how much will be left? We can enhance the people's willingness to serve the country through publicity and education, as well as improving the status of military personnel. We can also keep the people immersed in the joy of victory and beautiful illusions about the future for a long time. Franz, I didn't expect that you are still a Prussian lover. It is very dangerous for the army to own the country. Friedrich pointed at his head and said with a smile, Franz, you can find a way to save the Hungarians, which proves that you are a kind person. When an army owns a country, the people will suffer much more than now. You can ask the Prussians in your manner. Ask them if they want to go back. Albrecht said, Uncle Albrecht, I didn't expect that your honest and loyal appearance would actually mislead a child. Franz said seriously. Could working for a junker landowner be the same as working for the royal family? Franz's own operation. Doesn't he know the knowledge involved? Albrecht was a little embarrassed. Is it easier for an honest person to deceive someone? Why was he caught out the first time he lied to someone? Friedrich complained from the side. Brother, you think that people will suffer despite rise and fall? Who wrote that lyric? A Polish person, Albrecht asked incredulously. But, Franz, how did you come up with such heavy lyrics? Franz shook his head and said, it's not what I thought of, but what I read in a book. Then, another question. Franz, do you know how long it takes for the fastest shooter in the world to fire 3 shots? 44 seconds. In response to Albrecht's question and answer, Franz just shook his head, then opened a box, took out a revolver from it, and placed it on the table. With this, the latest Colt revolver, anyone can fire 6 shots in 5 seconds. Chapter 160 Investing in Shares. Vienna, Royal Garden. Friedrich spent a lot of effort to stop Albrecht. The gun Albrecht mentioned obviously did not include a pistol, but it only allowed Franz to forcefully take advantage of the loophole, which made him feel very humiliated. But Franz was right. Before the advent of the revolver, who could have imagined that a firearm capable of shooting 6 rounds in 5 seconds would actually appear at this time? The Colt revolver can directly fire continuously without pressing the hammer. Maybe one day a rifle that can fire continuously will appear. Thinking of this, Albrecht calmed down. You mean a breech-loading gun, right? Franz nodded, admiring in his heart, as expected of military family and a famous general. His reaction speed is indeed far beyond that of ordinary people in this era. A breech-loading gun looks beautiful, but it is expensive to make, has a very short range and poor accuracy. The most important thing is that this kind of gun is prone to various accidents, ranging from gunpowder burns to the face to serious injuries, including disability. Lethal. Albrecht's words contain the disadvantages of breech-loading guns. First of all, it is expensive. The price of a breech-loaded gun is almost 3 times that of a front-loaded gun. For a huge organization like the Austrian army, the funds required to update equipment are even greater. The breech-loading gun had a range of only 400 yards, while Austria's main musket had a range of 1000 yards. Since the mini bullet had not yet been invented, the accuracy of breech-loaded guns at this time was not as high as later generations imagined. On the contrary, jamming often occurred due to bullet problems, and even the bores of rifled guns were straight point. As for the accident, the most serious problem was the sealing problem. The gunpowder burned rapidly in the barrel of the gun, and hot gas sprayed from the gap in the breech to the shooter's face, leaving a very painful memory for the shooter, so much so that the test shooters were unwilling to operate this weapon, and many generals believed that the breech-loading gun was an inferior weapon. A noble gun should be eaten with the mouth, and a gun that eats with the anus is despicable. This is the consensus of the European military circles at this time. Uncle Albrecht, believe me, technology will definitely improve. Just leave the breech-loading gun to me. I plan to build an arsenal. Are you interested in investing in it? Franz asked. You short of money to buy shares? Albrecht took out a check and filled in the amount of 100,000 florins on it. At this time, the maximum denomination of a check was 100,000 florins, and only 2 banks in the Austrian Empire had such checks. One was the Rothschild Bank and the other was the Chartered Bank of the Austrian Empire. And 100,000 florins is definitely not a small number. It is about 1,000 years' salary of an ordinary soldier. 500 is almost the current value. Franz's annuity is 12,000 florins, which is the highest in the entire royal family, except the emperor himself, followed by his father and Grand Duke Louis with 10,000 florins, and his mother with only 5,000 florins. This money was nothing to Albrecht. After all, his father was the richest nobleman in the Austrian Empire. Franz didn't want to take a stake for money, but because he wanted him to keep the secret of the breech-loading gun. After all, Franz couldn't tell them that there would be a storm sweeping Europe in 1848, and the center of that storm would be the Austrian Empire. As far as Franz knew, there were massive rebellions throughout the Austrian Empire, except in Tyrol and Galicia. Franz, who has lived in Vienna for many years, knows very well how strong this city is. Not to mention the large number of military facilities and forts. There are 8,000 military police and 20,000 city defense troops in the city, as well as 122 armies outside the city. Troops were stationed, taking turns guarding the heart of the empire. For such an impregnable city to fall, there is no doubt that there is a traitor in the army. And who is the traitor? Franz didn't know how many people would rebel. But he knew very well that Albrecht and Friedrich in front of him would never participate in the rebellion. Albrecht was a conservative through and through. Although Friedrich had liberal ideas, he looked down on those liberals and was even less likely to directly participate in the rebellion. Although breech-loading guns are a major advancement in the history of rifles, they actually do not have too high technical barriers. Maybe countries like China and Vietnam cannot imitate it, but in Europe, even small countries like Sardinia and Serbia can easily produce it, as long as they are willing to invest manpower and material resources. So Franz hopes to use a breech-loading gun as a secret weapon and a trump card at critical moments. He now needs some people he can absolutely trust, such as the 2 brothers in front of him. Although Franz was not without money, he still quickly pocketed the money. Uncle Albrecht. In fact, Grandpa Carol has already given support in terms of funds. I will regard these 100,000 florins as additional investment. Albrecht and Friedrich didn't care about Franz's naked behavior of cheating money. It would be better to say that the family's attitude towards money was very indifferent. Franz, how do you want us to invest in it? Albrecht asked. You asking me and my eldest brother to hold billboards and stand on the streets of Vienna to shout for you? I think your two nannies are more suitable. Friedrich joked. Albrecht punched Friedrich in the head again. Miss Jenny is Franz's attendant and Miss Thalia is Franz's first teacher. You kid, be more respectful. Although Albrecht looks rough, he pays great attention to etiquette. Friedrich looked very unconvinced. Of course, he would not continue to contradict his eldest brother. After all, he knew well that a good man will not suffer the consequences of his immediate loss. He just said, Franz, stop being so pretentious. What do you want us to do? I need you to keep this secret and continue to speak out against breech-loading guns in front of people. Why? The two brothers asked in unison. They all felt that if it was an advanced weapon, it would gain the greatest value only if it was fully promoted in the Austrian Empire. Of course, Franz couldn't tell them that there would be a major rebellion in a few years, and then the entire Austrian Empire would be as chaotic as Werewolf and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, because this is a secret weapon. Of course, it must be used by trump cards to maximize its value. And we must also prevent other countries from imitating it, which will have a negative impact on our country. Breech loading guns are nothing new. The British have made them, and the Americans are also making them. You can't hide it. Friedrich said disdainfully. No, the breech loading gun Franz mentioned is not the British or American type, but a breech loading gun with no obvious flaws. Although the firing rate of the breech loading gun is not yet as high as 3 rounds in 10 seconds, but maybe it can be done after long-term training. Albrecht said. At this time, the rate of fire of breech loaded guns is actually generally 4 to 5 rounds, and a skilled shooter can shoot 7 to 8 rounds. Of course, as progress is made, the rate of fire of breech loaded guns will become faster and faster. Yes, I hope that our weapons can crush the weapons used by the enemy. Although the spirit of fair competition is worthy of appreciation, it does not belong to war. For war, victory is the only purpose. Franz said. Bullying people. I like it. Friedrich said. Albrecht nodded non-committally. The protagonist will come forward to solve the problem in Hungary. As for Austria's weakness, which makes people angry, Austria in history was even weaker than in the book. Chapter 161. Defeat magic with magic. Hungary, Budapest. The judgment of the Austrian Imperial government still aroused dissatisfaction in Hungary. They could not accept the new Austrian officials, let alone the existence of the inspector. Although the newly appointed officials are also Hungarians, they are all big nobles who have lived in Austria for a long time. These people have no concern for the interests of the rural nobles of Hungary. Although the stronger the power of the Hungarian landlords is, the more beneficial it is to them. These nobles do not have the courage to go to war with the Austrian Empire. On the contrary, they now fully support Zhni's statement that the relief and comfort work for the victims should be done well and beautifully. At the same time, they do not rule out the desire of the newly appointed officials to establish their authority. And these newly appointed officials soon discovered a problem. That is, the government did not have a penny, not a grain of grain, and even the 5.9 million florins that had just been confiscated were missing. This made the big nobles who lived in Vienna all year round feel very contemptible and even looked down on these country nobles. So the newly appointed officials began to recover these funds. First, because of the existence of the supervisor, they had to do it. Second, they did not get a share of the pie, so how could they be willing to take the blame for those rural nobles? But there is no reason to spit it out after eating it. So the local Hungarian nobles began to squeeze out the big nobles who came by air, but those big nobles were not given for free. The two sides fought each other to win or lose. However, Count Zhny, as the ombudsman, could not stand it anymore, because the two sides only focused on internal fighting and did not take care of the refugees. Many large cities in Hungary are flooded with refugees, and many refugees who fish in troubled waters take the opportunity to cause trouble in the city. On the one hand, SYNOPSIS wrote to the Austrian Imperial government to request continued funding, and on the other hand, he warned the two parties in the internal conflict not to embezzle money for disaster relief. Both sides dismissed SYNOPSIS' weak warning as nothing more than air. Along with SYNOPSIS, Kossuth was the inspector. He was supposed to be imprisoned, but under Franz's operation, this beast was released. His behavior was not like SYNOPSIS. Cheney is so gentle. As a public figure, visibility is his life force, and Kossuth knows this. At the same time, as an ultra-nationalist, he cannot turn a blind eye to his supporters. In order to continue to expand his influence, Kossuth organized a group of people to march to the Hungarian parliament with refugees, and surrounded the fighting parties in the Hungarian parliament hall. "We want bread. We want work," Kossuth shouted. "We want bread. We want jobs." The victims and Kossuth supporters shouted, "Hand over the relief money." In fact, just now, Kossuth, along with his supporters and refugees, raided Count Pilla's mansion and found the relief bill. The 35.9 million florins in relief funds were actually spent, and not a penny was left. Some of the entries are even more outrageous. For example, a small garden in front of Count Pilla's house was destroyed by the storm, and the repair cost was as high as 1.5 million florins at this time. The world's largest stadium cost £50,000, which is 500,000 florins. The Crystal Palace, that shocked the world in Britain in 1851, cost £80,000. Comparing it, you will know how outrageous Count Pilla's garden is. Kossuth certainly knew how to incite the people. The indignant people surrounded the Hungarian parliament, and countless stones rained down on the doors and windows of the parliament. Count Pilla himself was tied to a cross, and the people erected the cross in front of the parliament. Count Pilla was only wearing a pair of underwear at this time. His mouth was gagged, and his head tilted to one side, like the suffering Jesus. Kossuth read the contents of the account book loudly, and from time to time explained to the people the crimes committed by the Hungarian nobles. Every time he said a word, the crowd would let out a gasp. Although Kossuth came to power with the support of the nobles, he was not willing to be just a puppet, and his supporters were not the country nobles, but the big nobles in Vienna. He is now announcing the crimes of those rural nobles, which is undoubtedly helping the big nobles seize power at the same time. This righteous act will also make Kossuth a real prince, because the people will remember him as a hero who is not afraid of power. This kind of real good thing has a much better effect than promoting Magyarism and the Austrian threat theory. In the ledger, Kossuth even found an opportunity to suppress his opponent, Count SYNOPSIS. 3 stone steps, 1.2 million florins. The crowd let out a burst of exclamation. Although some people questioned that Count SYNOPSIS should be a good man, they were even more shocked by this number. Coupled with the infection of the surrounding people, they no longer sought the truth, but let out a burst of surprise in accordance with the rhythm of the crowd call. 1.2 million florins, 878.68 kilograms of gold. Are the steps of Count SYNOPSIS' house made of gold? Hand over the thief. Hand over the money you stole from us. The crowd shouted excitedly, and the few voices of doubt and opposition were instantly drowned in the surging crowd. Originally, the two factions in the parliament hall hoped to use Count SYNOPSIS' reputation to stabilize the irritable people, but now it seems that there is no hope. In fact, as soon as the crowd took to the streets, the military police and the army noticed that something was wrong, but neither side stopped them. After all, they did not get the order. If the noble gentlemen had the intention, they would be nothing more than dogs and mice. Moreover, the anarchy in Hungary has not lasted for more than a day or two, and we have seen countless demonstrations. Today they are anti-Austria, tomorrow they are anti-Catholic, and the day after tomorrow they are anti-slave trade. But even though angry people surrounded the parliament hall, the two parties still couldn't reach a consensus by night. Kossuth was tired of shouting, and the people's enthusiasm was defeated by the secreted gastric juice, so the crowd had no choice but to disperse. Kossuth did not have the courage to lead the people to attack the Hungarian parliament hall, because he only wanted fame, not death. The leaders of the uprisings in Europe during this period almost never ended well. He had already been arrested once, and he knew very well how vulnerable those so-called supporters were in front of the gendarmes attacking the Hungarian parliament. All was undoubtedly a declaration of war against the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. The consequences were something he could not bear. As for the young people among the victims, most of them had been moved to the royal estate by Franz. The remaining people just wanted to have a good meal, and they had no interest in rebellion. As for Kossuth's supporters and the refugees who fish in troubled waters, they are not here to fight for the real benefits. Even ultranationalists do not want to attack their own people. Only a few fanatics wanted to make the matter bigger, but Kossuth was not an idiot. His purpose of putting pressure on the government had been achieved, and there was no need to risk his life for it, so he ordered the crowd to disperse. The big nobles and country nobles dispersed when they saw the crowd outside, and a new round of more intense quarrels broke out between the two sides. Just when everyone thought the day would end in a ridiculous farce, the Hungarian parliament all burst into flames. Franz believed that only magic could defeat magic, so he released Kossuth. But the truth about this parliamentary arson case can only be left to future generations to comment on. Chapter 162 Parliament Arson Case. March 2, 1839. Hungary. For ordinary people living in Pest, this day was no different. The streets were still noisy, filled with melancholy and lifeless people. From time to time, people in the river shouted excitedly because they found the property on the corpse, and homeless people walked through the streets in groups. The aristocratic gentlemen would have dance parties in their own homes, singing and dancing day and night without stopping for a hangover. People who became rich due to the food crisis would sit high in the cafe and look down at their masterpieces. A fire broke the tranquility of the city, with black smoke billowing from the Hungarian Parliament Hall and the sound of glass exploding. However, the surrounding residents watched all this happening in confusion, as if it had nothing to do with them. In fact, the Hungarian Parliament Hall is an independent building, and it does not affect other people. But even the firefighters didn't show up. In response to Count Pillar's passive resistance policy, the fire chief went directly to Belgium for vacation. Those who were supposed to be at the fire scene were drunk at the station point. When the police chief knocked on the door of the fire brigade, he was told by the firefighters that they had the day off. Seeing the attitude of the fire brigade, the police chief simply went home and lay down. As the Hungarian Parliament Hall was engulfed in fire, the big nobles mainly living in Vienna, country nobles living in Hungary, and Kossuth all felt that the fire was too strange and must have been intentional for it. However, none of the three parties admitted that they released it, but someone must be responsible for this. The country nobles felt that it must be the fanatics under Kossuth who had done something good. After all, they could strip a gentleman like Count Pillar naked and tie him to a cross. There was nothing crazy they couldn't do. Kossuth felt that the country nobles did not want to cough up relief funds, so he burned the entire parliament and blamed the people. Kossuth's view was supported by the great nobles. After all, the stolen money was in the hands of the rural nobles. Without the parliament hall, the Hungarian government could only shut down so that they could evade their responsibilities. The rural nobles retorted that the Hungarian government would not be shut down even if the parliament hall was missing. Maybe the big nobles wanted to skip the Hungarian parliament and exercise their rights directly, so they burned the parliament hall. All three parties had reasons for setting fire, but the suspicion of the rural nobles was obviously greater, and it was more in line with the interests of the great nobles in Kossuth. Attacking the rural aristocracy is beneficial to both the great nobility and Kossuth. For the great nobility, it can better consolidate its power and at the same time dominate Hungary's interests. For Kossuth, on the one hand, it can establish itself in the minds of the people. On the other hand, the big nobles needed an agent in Hungary. After the fall of the rural nobles, he was the ideal candidate. As a result, the two sides hit it off immediately, and the arson case turned into a premeditated rebellion. The great nobles continued to send news about Hungary back to Vienna to build momentum for their subsequent counter-rebellion. Kossuth, the censor, also used his power to block the mouthpieces of the rural nobles. Of course, the rural nobles would not sit back and wait for death. They decided to strike first, so the horse bandits who dared to attack even the royal estate rushed into Budapest and madly pursued the nobles. Kossuth and his cronies. A real-life battle royale was staged in Budapest, Hungary. Horse bandits rampaged through the streets, but the police stations and gendarmerie kept their doors closed. The corpses of civilians were everywhere. Horse bandits broke into hotels and personal mansions, and pulled out the newly appointed noble officials, and executed them. Some officials were protected by guards, so the horse bandits set fire to all nearby buildings, to force them out. The opinion leaders in the tavern did not escape the fate. They were dragged through the streets by horse bandits in search of Mr. Kossuth, whom they supported. At this time, their Mr. Kossuth was hiding in the home of a French female reporter. When the horse bandits entered the city, Kossuth had just finished the interview and was discussing life with the female reporter, so he escaped. Some sought refuge in churches, but God did not bless his people. The horse bandits rushed into the church and took away the person they were looking for. At the same time, they set a fire in the church and sealed the door, leaving the people inside to cry and curse. For the horse bandits, this is a good day. After all, the city's fuel and water are much better than those of the caravans. A small number of people escaped Budapest on horseback under the desperate protection of the guards. When they came to the garrison barracks to seek help, they found that someone was already waiting for them. The next day, the city returned to its former appearance, except for the burned buildings and dead people. The rural nobles felt that everything could be left to the horse bandits as usual, and then the problem would be solved by just finding some serfs to take the blame. However, on the third day, the Austrian army arrived in Budapest by ship, led by Archduke Albrecht. Those killed were indeed Hungarians, but many of them were also members of the Vienna City Defense Force. Justice Albrecht was the commander of the City Defense Army. Although his City Defense Army was known as the worst army in the Austrian Empire, it was still not comparable to the military police and horse bandits at the same time. Under the operation of the great nobles in Vienna, the rebellion in Budapest was carried out. Even Prince Esterházy went to the Hall of Mirrors in person to request the Emperor's order to quell the rebellion. The Emperor's order was quickly passed by the Regency Council. The previous Prince Esterházy has died, and is now his successor. After all, the Regent Council has long wanted to attack Hungary. This time, not only was there an imperial order from the Emperor, but it was also proposed by the Hungarians themselves. It would be strange if they didn't do it. Albrecht was visited by many Hungarian nobles. On the surface, these people were trying to quell the rebellion and avenge their relatives, but in fact they were bribing Albrecht, hinting that he would rather kill him by mistake than let him go. Albrecht had long disliked those slave traders and rebels. After receiving dual support, he immediately started to attack horse bandits and corruption in a two-pronged approach. The problem of horse bandits plagued Hungary until the end of World War II. It was only later that the Soviet Union completely eliminated the horse bandits that had been entrenched in Hungary for thousands of years. However, these horse bandits were quickly defeated under the pursuit of the so-called Worst Legion in Austria, and the manors, where they were hiding, were found one by one. Another clue leading to the embezzlement of 35.9 million florins in disaster relief funds also emerged. A large number of Hungarian nobles and officials were arrested, many of whom had participated in the previous slave trade. Albrecht led the Vienna City Defense troops to raid homes everywhere in Budapest, and the nobles were not idle either. They were desperately trying to make accusations against their opponents, who had murdered their family members. Soon Albrecht returned to Vienna with 35.9 million florins in disaster relief funds. The money would be redistributed for refugee relief, but the vast majority of it went to Franz's estate. The Regency Council had no objection to this. After all, Franz's manor did absorb a large number of refugees, and the strength of the royal family was also conducive to the stability of the country. This was an indisputable fact in the Austrian Empire. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 163 Accident. Vienna. Council. Since Emperor Ferdinand I was unable to attend, the Council of Regents acted on his behalf. In fact, even if Ferdinand I was present, his order still needed the signature of the Regent Council to take effect. Count Latter, I think you should be able to withdraw the temporary garrison in Transylvania to their original garrison. Count Korolaf has not forgotten his promise to Palmerston. After all, honesty and trustworthiness are key. The noble qualities that a noble should have. Count Tyrol was heartened by the bloodshed in Budapest, but regretted that the Austrian military was not directly involved. Now that the bloody conflict has been resolved, there is no reason to station troops in Transylvania. As for the Russians and Ottomans on the other side of the mountain, he is not worried at all. After all, Transylvania is not Rome, Russia is not Carthage, and they do not have a general like Hannibal. Even if they did, what was the point of a surprise attack on Transylvania? Are you waiting to be caught in the trap by the Austrian Empire's army? After all, it is easy to turn it over, but it is not so easy to turn it back again. The militarist suggestion to seize the two principalities on the Danube was strongly rejected by Count Metternich and Count Korolaf. Both believed that the militarist behavior was tantamount to self-destruction. Moreover, on the opposite side of the Carpathian Mountains, the Russian and Ottoman armies are already ready, and there is no value in continuing to station troops here. The situation in Hungary has stabilized, and the military has agreed to withdraw. But I want to remind you that the Ottomans are at their weakest in hundreds of years, and now is a good time to defeat it. The barbaric Russians, once they inherit the Ottomans, the legacy will seriously threaten the eastern frontier of the empire. Count Latter said plausibly. Count Korolaf feels that a strong Russia is a good thing. After all, only under a strong threat can the weak vassal states of the German Confederation understand the world situation and realize who is their real protector. Prince Metternich believed that uniting Russia was an indispensable condition for the Austrian Empire to maintain its status as a great power. Moreover, it was not easy for Russia to swallow the Ottoman legacy. There are a large number of mountains and rivers blocking Austria and Russia. As long as a few key fortresses are captured, Russia can be prevented from advancing westward. What's more, according to the instructions of Peter's edict, after the Russians obtained a warm outlet to the sea, they should compete with the British for India. At that time, the Austrian Empire will be free to deal with France with all its strength. The most important thing now is to find a way to win Serbia, solve Austria's worries, and make every effort to digest Italy. Count Tyrol, I think you can withdraw the army to Novi Sad. After all, the fortress is in disrepair, and it's time for someone to take care of it. The upright Count Tyrol did not understand the meaning of Count Metternich's words and shouted, "Your Majesty Prime Minister, my soldiers are not decoration workers. If you want to repair the fortress, you should look for maintenance workers, not the army." Count Korolaf was used to this kind of chicken and duck talk, so he changed his words. Count Tyrol, the Prime Minister hopes that you can station the army in Novi Sad to prevent the Ottomans from causing friction on the border. They, damn heretics. Even though they have 350,000 troops, our Austrian Empire only needs 300,000 troops to recover Constantinople. Count Tyrol's mood immediately rose. As long as he was fighting against the Ottomans, he supports all actions. Metternich advocated stationing troops in Novi Sad, not to attack Serbia directly, but to allow Russia to take the initiative to negotiate with him. At the same time, stationing troops in Novi Sad also meant to wait for an opportunity. Once the scale of the war expanded, it exceeded all parties' expectations. Then Austria can find any reason to attack Serbia. Gentlemen, although some states in Italy are ruled by members of the royal family, their expansion has affected the interests of the Austrian Empire. Especially Duchess Marisa, who borrowed heavily in the name of the empire and blatantly embezzled national property. Before Metternich finished speaking, he was interrupted by Count Korolaf. The Duchess has made many sacrifices for this empire, and we can no longer criticize her. I suggest that Baron Oker and those Parma officials who bewitched the Duchess be severely punished, and a group of honest and reliable people from the Austrian Empire be selected to be sent to Parma, and at the same time draw a clear line between debts. Count Korolaf's words were affirmed by the two royal princes. Of course, they just nodded and did not take any substantive action. However, at this time, Duchess Marissa had long lost her value in Metternich's eyes, and now she had become an obstacle to Italy in the rule of the Austrian Empire. The small states in central Italy have lost their value, and now the Austrian Empire needs to integrate central Italy into northern Italy in order to maximize its value. Although these small countries do not have much strength to compete with the powerful Austria, the rulers of these small countries are inextricably linked to the royal family. If it is done too radically, it will inevitably arouse the dissatisfaction of the royal family, and the Regency Council will not allow such an order to pass. For this reason, Prince Metternich had to find a way to prove to the Regency Council that the fragmented status quo of China and Italy was no longer in the interest of the empire. In fact, this was what he mentioned when he was teaching Archduke Franz. Prince Metternich praised joining the German Zollverein as the greatest decision in Emperor Franz II's life. Archduke Franz asked why Austria could not form another Italian customs union. Archduke Franz, you are very smart, but think about why your grandfather, the great Emperor Franz II, didn't do this. Prince Metternich said to himself, the politics between countries are not isolated. France, which has competed with the Austrian Empire for Italy for hundreds of years, has not given up its ambitions for Italy. The Bourbon dynasty from France is even ruling the land at the southern tip of Italy, and Sardinia. The kingdom also clung to France. The British would not want a powerful country to dominate Italy, which would destroy their so-called balance of power. Prince Metternich cleared his throat and continued, let's see what your grandfather did. The Austrian Empire opened 3 ports and 6 towns to the central and Italian states, allowing free trade from the central and Italian states to Austria, and only charged a nominal fee tariffs. At the same time, it is planned to build a railway connecting the entire China and Italy. Franz took out a thick stack of documents and placed them on the table. But what's the result? What benefits does this kind of unilateral tribute trade have to the Austrian Empire? While it has a trade deficit, the trade volume is less than 3% of the German customs union, and it makes almost no contribution to tax collection. All the money earned by the countries of China and Italy flowed into the hands of these corrupt officials. They used it to buy French and British goods, which in the end benefited our enemies. In the past 5 years, the Austrian Empire has built countless railways, but the Sino-Italian railway still only exists on sketches. Doesn't such low efficiency explain the problem? Chapter 164 Apennine Business Alliance. Metternich looked at the numbers on the document, and the content could only be described as shocking. Although the Archduke Franz in front of him has shown superhuman wisdom since he was a child. But the entire upper class had a rather disdainful evaluation of the professors who taught Franz. After all, many aristocratic parents have heard such comments as your son/daughter is very smart, but just refuses to work hard. And they know the trick very well. But Metternich knew that those professors did not give too much praise. As one of Franz's teachers, he knew very well how outstanding the young man in front of him was. He was destined to inherit the throne from birth, and the late emperor was even willing to risk the disapproval of the world and write a will to let him inherit the throne when he was 18 years old. At only 7 years old, he can speak 8 languages. All the teachers who have taught him think he is a genius once seen in a century. Being able to come up with a solution to the refugee problem at the age of 8, although a bit immature, does provide a new idea for the empire to solve the refugee problem. Compared with providing simple relief of funds and food, relief for work is indeed not as good as using the state apparatus to organize the construction of large-scale projects for refugees. This will not only benefit the country, but also allow disaster victims to find jobs and earn money, thus achieving a win-win situation. Archduke Franz was often able to give his own opinions on national affairs, which was particularly rare. Of course, ordinary children at this age do not have the opportunity to be exposed to politics. Prince Metternich clapped his hands to show his appreciation for Franz. Dear Archduke Franz, the empire's losses in Italy are indeed heartbreaking, but that is to maintain the empire's status in central Italy. Similarly, maintaining the stability of the empire's surrounding environment is very important for the current empire. I have lived in this empire since I was a child, but I have never seen this empire as peaceful and vibrant as it is today, and its economy is developing at an unprecedented speed point. Even though so many bad things happened last year, it did not slow down the progress of the empire. Its economy is still growing at a rapid rate of 11% per year. The empire's position within the German Confederation is unshakable. But the empire's fiscal revenue was still less than half that of France, and only a little more than 1/6 that of Britain. Archduke Franz, you will definitely become a great monarch in the future, but please be patient now. The Austrian Empire still needs time. In the same year, the UK's economy grew by 2%, Belgium's economy grew by 21%, France's economy grew by 4%, and Prussia's economy grew by 8%. Russia and the United States made a fortune due to the food crisis, and Spain each occupied half of the country due to the civil war, so it is not counted for the time being. Your Excellency, I did not say that I wanted to annex Sino-Italy, but only to establish a commercial alliance. The purpose is to integrate the entire Sino-Italy into the Austrian economic system. Only by joining this cycle can they truly integrate into Austria. The tribute trade currently implemented in our country was also done by a large eastern country in the past. Even after hundreds of years, it still cannot assimilate those vassals. Therefore, it is an inevitable choice to integrate those Italian states into the economic system led by Austria. Moreover, Britain and France are all attacking all over the world, so how can they have time to come to China and Italy to take care of our family affairs? As for the old man, the Pope, he is probably more concerned about whether his rule can continue, right? France's words made Metternich think deeply. Now is indeed a good opportunity. The French were internally divided. The Bonapartists always held great power, and although the workers' uprising was temporarily subdued, it only took a spark to reignite the war externally. The Berbers of Algeria have never surrendered. The Spanish Civil War has been on and off. Although the Carolists are at a disadvantage, they can always make the French and Spanish government forces return without success due to their geographical location. The Queen Regent's debauchery and enjoyment also caused dissatisfaction in Spain. Coupled with natural disasters and war, her rule was already in danger. The Texas colony brought rich rewards to France, but also fed its endless ambitions. The massive dispatch of troops to the Central American Federation plunged the French into endless jungle and mountain warfare. On the frontal battlefield, a French regiment could defeat Carrera's indigenous warriors, but in the mountain jungles of Central America, they experienced the helplessness of the US military in Vietnam. More than 100 years later, to kill a French soldier, Carrera had to lose at least 3 indigenous warriors, but this battle-loss ratio was still unacceptable to the French. What is even more troublesome for the French is Morazin's perverse behavior. As a representative of extreme liberalism, he first pretended to invite conservatives to form a new government. After retaking Guatemala City, Morazin began a major purge. He nailed conservatives who opposed him to a cross as a warning. Later, he executed conservative officers on charges of collaborating with the enemy. Finally, due to the unsatisfactory war, they organized the remaining conservatives into troops and sent them to their deaths. The great development of Texas has also sounded the alarm to the United States of America and Mexico in North America. The arms race among the 3 countries continues to escalate. Mexico maintains a force of 50,000 people, and the Americans even plan to form a force of 100,000 people. Powerful army. The British started wars all over the world. From Tasmania in the southern hemisphere, Tasmanian massacre, to residential schools in Canadian Columbia, Indian and Inuit concentration camps, with a death rate higher than the concentration camps during World War II. Still high, from the La Plata River in South America to the Nile River in Egypt, to the Ottoman Empire, Indian states, Afghanistan, and an ancient eastern country. The British spread war all over the world. At this time, Britain, France, and Russia were all working hard for hegemony in the Near East. The outcome of the Turkish-Egyptian War would greatly affect the ownership of hegemony in the Near East. The support of the Austrian Empire would undoubtedly be an important weight in the balance. As for the Pope, how many divisions does he have? Although Metternich talked about principles and rules, he was actually an opportunist. Just as Metternich first persuaded Francis II to marry his daughter to Napoleon and become his ally. Later, when Napoleon defeated Moscow, he tore up the agreement with Napoleon and added insult to injury. However, no one cares about his treachery. People only know that he brought decades of peace to Europe and maintained Austria's dignity. Metternich knew that this was the best opportunity to realize the legacy of his late emperor, and it might also be the last political resource he left for the Austrian Empire. After all, Metternich was 66 years old at this time, and his energy and physical strength were gradually failing him. Archduke Franz, you are right. A brand new Apennine customs union that can guarantee the interests of all parties should indeed be established. I wish you good luck, my prime minister. Franz still believed in Metternich's ability to do things. There was no problem with him talking or drawing on the map. But if Franz is really asked to formulate a complete national policy, coordinate various departments, and put it into practice, he does not yet have the ability. Vienna, Regency Council, Duchess Marissa has indeed made a lot of sacrifices for this empire, so she should not continue to work. It is better to let her retire. We should now establish a new Apennine customs union to protect their and the interests of the country. Metternich's words were like throwing a stone on the calm water, causing an uproar immediately. Ask for votes. Chapter 165 Accident. Are you crazy? Count Corolaf roared immediately. Once the Duchess gives up her position as Duke, then Parma will be handed over to the Bourbon family. That's why we need the Apennine Customs Union, to protect our own interests. As long as Central Italy is included in the Austrian economic system. Even if the Bourbon family wants to break away from our influence, those civilians and businessmen will not. I will agree. Besides, who can have trouble with money? Metternich said very calmly. Count Corolaf was not an idiot. He understood that Metternich was right. The previous idea of trying to control various countries with advisors was simply fanciful. Those expatriate officials almost lost contact with their home country after arriving in the country and were no longer bound by the laws of their country. Without exception, they either became officials of the country where they were located or directly became cancerous tumors. What about the attitudes of Britain and France? Shouldn't Britain and France look at our attitude now? Metternich asked rhetorically. Where is the Papal State? Count Corolaf asked. The Pope also needs our country to help him maintain his rule. If the Papal State is willing to join us, that would be best. If not, it doesn't matter to us. Count Corolaf could hear that Metternich's words were full of confidence. Although he was very unhappy, the huge benefits that the German customs union had brought to the Austrian Empire were obvious to all. And Count Corolaf always believed that he was different from those corrupt criminals who betrayed the Austrian Empire. He was just serving the Austrian Empire and satisfying his personal needs, so he did not struggle with Metternich on this matter. Okay, I agree with Prince Metternich, Archduke Franz. Carol and Archduke Louis looked at each other. Honestly, they didn't understand. Ever since, it's still the old rule. Don't agree, don't object. In fact, when the Apennine Customs Union was first established, it was only considered a game for the Habsburg family to entertain themselves, because the Kingdom of Sardinia, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies all refused to join. King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies wanted to get the Pope to establish the South Asia Pacific Customs Union to counter Austria's influence, but he was rejected by the latter at this time. Pope Gregory XVI was very conservative. He hated many things, but he only liked money. He engaged in the financial industry in the Vatican and successively established financial institutions such as the Discount Bank, the Bank of Rome, the Holy Spirit Bank and the Savings Bank. However, he lacked business ability, so he lost everything. Later, the Pope established a holy water company. Unlike the Austrian Holy Water Company, that sells dog meat in sheep's clothing, what it sells is not bleaching powder and medical alcohol, but real holy water. Although Gregory XVI relied on Austria to maintain his rule, he did not want the Austrians or the Two Sicilies to make money from him. France expressed strong protest against Austria's actions and repeatedly reiterated that France would protect the independence of the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Papal States. The attitude of the British is ambiguous. They hope that Austria and France can fight in Italy. If France could go to war with Austria in Italy, then Muhammad Ali of Egypt would undoubtedly be alone. Britain could easily achieve its goal, and the only remaining enemy would be Russia. Of course, the French would not let the British succeed, so the French's protests against Austria were always verbal. The most anxious one is the Kingdom of Sardinia, because its main source of income is as a second line dealer between France and Italy. Once Austria's Apennine customs union includes the Papal States and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Kingdom of Sardinia will have to choose sides for Collo Alberto, a monarch who wanted to unify Italy. This was simply more uncomfortable than killing him. It's just that Austria at this time is an invincible behemoth for Alberto, but he believes that one day he will find that opportunity. Ottoman Empire. Istanbul. News of the withdrawal of the Austrian Imperial army from Transylvania soon reached Istanbul. Palmerston let out a sigh of relief. If Count Korolov accepted his money but didn't do anything, he would be really angry to death. Palmerston never expected to bribe officials outside of Britain one day, but now the Austrians have finally withdrawn from Transylvania. Now Mehmed II finally had no reason to continue to delay. For the great cause of Britain, Russia must be restricted. Another war in Central Asia to block Russia is starting. This is also the first time that Western powers have invaded Afghanistan. In Palmerston's plan, he will use 3 victories to completely block Russia's exports in Asia, forcing it to compete with Austria and Prussia for Germany. There is only one thing that Britain has to do, and that is maintain the balance of power on the continent. In this way, Britain can be in a position of eternal glory and independence. No country can compete with Britain for world hegemony, and for this, he will do whatever it takes. At the Grand Salacilio Palace, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was looking at the report with pleasure. The total strength of the Egyptians is only 230,000, while the Ottoman Empire's army has reached 350,000. The military strength comparison in Syria was even 3-1, and there seemed to be unrest within Egypt. The original 70,000 Syrian legions were now only 30,000. Coupled with the news of the Austrian withdrawal from Transylvania just sent by Palmerston, the Ottoman Empire can mobilize 300,000 troops to completely wipe out Egypt and avenge its previous humiliation. It's just that instructor Molt poured cold water on Mahmud II. Your army training has not been completed. At this time, even the third-rate European army cannot reach the level. I still need time to turn them into real warriors. Moltke's words made Mehmed II very unhappy, because Moltke had a low opinion of his army, and the former always seemed to have the pride that was unique to Europeans at this time. How many years have you commanded my army? Mehmed II asked. 3 years. Moltke replied. You haven't been able to train a qualified new army in 3 years. You are fired, sir. Mahmud II's tone left no room for doubt. You will lose miserably. Malki left these words and left the palace without looking back. Mahmud II really wanted to have this damn European beheaded, but he did not have the courage to have a conflict with European countries. Now Mahmud II only wants to hang the head of Muhammad Ali, the traitor, on the minaret of the Grand Salacilio Palace. In a hidden base on the Syrian border. Abdul, if the Ottomans don't come within a month, I will shave your beard and tie you to a tree to dry in the Sunday. Ali's eldest son, Iprazin, said to the Prime Minister. Abdul said. On April 1, 1839, the Ottoman army crossed the Euphrates River and marched towards Syria. On March 15 of the same year, the Austrian Imperial army left Transylvania, and Mehmed II transferred the main force of the northern front to Syria. On April 20, the Austrian army arrived in Novi Sad. On the one hand, the Bosnian governor summoned the militia to build fortifications, and on the other hand, he sent people to report to the Ottoman Sultan urgently. Chapter 166, Left-handed and Right-handed. May 1839. The sudden appearance of Austrian troops in Novi Sad caused panic to the governor of Bosnia, and Serbia sent a distress signal to the Ottoman Empire. Because as long as the Austrians cross the Danube, they can attack them. The Austrian side has at least 50,000 regular troops, and at this time, neither Bosnia nor Serbia can produce a force that can counter it. After Serbia overthrew the rule of Miloš Obrenović, the entire country fell into turmoil. The members of the 17-member parliament bribed the Ottoman Pasha who was stationed here for the so-called supreme rights. They continue to attack each other. This is a good thing for the Ottoman Empire, and Esel Pasha is also happy to see this kind of scene. He wants to take advantage of the weakness of the Serbian disunity to weaken their power, and ultimately achieve the purpose of regaining control of Serbia. However, the sudden visit of the Austrian Imperial army made the situation suddenly tense. Vucic, who seemed to have the advantage, lost troops and generals in the civil war, and even offended the Serbian princes. Behind Vucic are the Russians, and behind Miloš Obrenović, who was suppressed by him, are the Austrians. In fact, Miloš Obrenović has never been truly loyal to any party. He can follow Karadzic, the former leader of the Serbian independence faction, to pursue independence. He can also behead Karadzic for the sake of glory and wealth, and give his head to the Sultan as a ladder for his promotion. He could declare allegiance to Russia for independence, or he could flirt with Austria, to get rid of Russian influence. Miloš always had only one purpose: to establish Greater Serbia. In his mind, Greater Serbia was a super empire that included Slovenia, Croatia, and the entire Balkan Peninsula. Miloš's duplicity had already offended Austria, Russia and the Ottoman Empire. But Vucic and the 17-member parliament did not know this, and they only thought that the Austrians were sending troops to help Miloš suppress the rebellion. Vucic's envoy soon arrived in Russia, but was told that the Tsar could only guarantee that Serbia would not be annexed by Austria. The reinforcement were only a Russian military advisor, and even the ubiquitous Russian spies had disappeared without realizing it. At this time, Vucic and the 17-member council could only temporarily abandon their personal prejudices, stop attacking each other, and seek help from the Ottoman Empire together. On the other hand, the Bosnian Pasha was also panicked. Serbia had an army of 15,000 people and Esel Pasha's 5,000 Ottoman soldiers. However, there were only 5,000 soldiers in the whole of Bosnia, and they were still distributed in among nearly 100 fortresses, large and small. Bosnia is a negative profit province of the Ottoman Empire. The taxes collected are not enough to cover the cost of maintaining its stability. There are 150,000 Croatians and nearly 300,000 Serbs living in Bosnia. The local Bosnia there are only 240,000 Nigerians. The above three ethnic groups are all regarded as disloyal ethnic groups by the Orthodox Ottomans. I'm afraid that the Austrian Empire is going to attack Bosnia, and he can only take his troops to guerrilla. News reached Istanbul. Mehmed II was furious. Damn it. The guy who doesn't believe what he says. The treacherous villain. The barbaric Russians, the despicable Austrians, the shameless British. Mehmed II scolded the great powers, but he could only ask the Grand Vizier Furkak to urgently recall the troops in the Balkans, and let the troops return to Tulsia to continue the confrontation with Russia across the Danube River, and at the same time divide the troops. Reinforce Serbia. Bosnia was of low importance to the Ottoman Empire. Its benefits were negligible and the costs of maintaining stability were high. Facing this rotten land, the Ottoman Empire also ruled in a rotten state. The Ottomans only had strongholds in towns, and they could collect as much tax as they could. The rebels turned a blind eye, as long as they did not cry for independence or attack the city. More than 90% of this area is rugged mountainous terrain, and crop yields are less than 1/5 of those in the neighboring province of Vojvodina. Industrial and commercial trade was almost non-existent, and by the 19th century survival was still dependent on farming, animal husbandry, fishing, and hunting. Moreover, the mountain people here are wild, untamable, tough and warlike, and they will rebel and cause trouble at every turn. The Ottoman Empire sent large armies to encircle and suppress the city many times, but all failed. Although this piece of rotten land was the ancestral inheritance of the Ottomans, Mehmed II did not feel sorry for losing it at all. On the contrary, Serbia, which is now basically independent, cannot afford to lose anything to the Ottoman Empire. Because once Serbia falls, Austria's path into the Ottoman Empire will be clear. There is also a century-old grudge between the two countries. Once the Austrians taste blood, Bayobuki will become the next Russia and start a Turkish-Austrian war at every turn. Therefore, at this time, Mehmed II had to leave 150,000 troops to confront Russia and Austria. There were only 200,000 troops on the southern front, which was weaker than Muhammad Ali's troops. He could only hope that the civil strife in Egypt was real, and that his vanguard could directly take over Syria. Syrian battlefield. The vanguard of the Ottomans, led by Hafez Pasha, quickly entered Syria and met no resistance at first. He wanted to take advantage of the Egyptians' lack of troops to capture Damascus in one fell swoop. However, what Hafez Pasha did not know was that from the moment he entered Syria, he had fallen into Ibrahim's trap. When the Ottoman army advanced all the way to Aleppo, Hafez Pasha decided to repair and replenish supplies in the small town of Nizip. As a result, they were ambushed by the Egyptian troops in Nizip and Ibrahim's main force that followed. They suffered heavy losses from front and rear attacks. Hafez Pasha himself was also captured. Ibrahim personally beheaded Hafez Pasha and cut off the beards of all the prisoners of war and gave them to Mahmud II as gifts in the Grand Salaquilio Palace. The 54-year-old Mahmud II cursed Muhammad Ali and everything in the world. He himself worked day and night all his life to reform, but he suffered repeated setbacks. At this time, he was almost crazy. The news of the tragic defeat was torn to pieces by him, and Hafez Pasha's head was kicked away by him. I still have a new army. I still have a fleet. Send the Mahmudiyah. Tell Amd that, if you can't win, come and see him. Go and call that Palmerston over. Where is the British support? If I don't see the British fleet, I will chop off his head. Fair. Shak wrote the order worriedly. He didn't know where the war would go, but he was more worried about the Sultan's health than the war. 54 years old is considered a long life in this era. Average age 30 years old. After receiving the order, the frontline commander Amd immediately ordered the army to march along the coastline. The land and water armies moved hand in hand so that they could support each other when encountering the Egyptian army. But what Amd Pasha didn't know was that the Ottoman Empire's navy had long been bribed by Muhammad Ali. Chapter 167 Undercurrent. May 20th, 1839. The fighting off the Syrian coast is over before it even begins. Once the war began, the Egyptian navy and the renegade Ottoman navy joined forces. Under the bombardment of hundreds of cannons, the new Ottoman army could only escape in panic. June 4, 1839. The new Ottoman army fled into the small town of Nizip to prepare for a final stand with the Egyptian army. The Fourth Battle of Nizip broke out. As soon as the battle began, the Egyptian army, equipped with French weapons, gained the upper hand. Although the Egyptian army only has 70,000 soldiers, it has won consecutive battles under the leadership of Ibrahim. At the same time, the training of French instructors has made the Egyptian army closer to a modern army. Its morale and discipline are not comparable to the Ottoman army. On the other hand, although the Ottoman army still has 100,000 troops and occupies a favorable terrain, they have not completed their training and are still just a classical army. The Egyptians only had 40 cannons, but they were able to make 100,000 troops scurry away. The number of Ottoman soldiers who died from the cannon fire was not as many as those who were trampled to death. Ibrahim saw the incompetence of the new Ottoman army, and his experience studying in France made him believe that offense is the true meaning of war. Following Ibrahim's order, the first to charge was the Sultan's slave army. The Anubis army, Sudan, was an African country near Egypt that Ali sent troops to conquer. Some Sudanese worshipped the conqueror, believing that he was the incarnation of Anubis, the god of death, and volunteered to join his army, which was called the Army of Death or the Legion of Anubis by the Egyptians. After the Anubis Legion with shields and scimitars came the new Egyptian army. They used the latest percussion guns and had bayonets mounted. They were victorious in every battle and were not afraid of Ottoman artillery fire. On the other hand, on the opponent's side, Amd and his firing squad, even if they created corpses all over the ground, still could not stop the rout of their new army and save their own morale, which had sunk to the bottom. Amd's family was still in Istanbul. It was impossible for him to surrender, and the beliefs of the Cheyenne Fang sect prevented him from committing suicide. So he fired the last bullet in the gun, and then pulled out the scimitar encrusted with jewels and diamonds, rushed towards the Egyptian army that was killing them. If the new Egyptian army saw Amd Pasha, they would definitely find a way to capture him alive. After all, it would be a great achievement To capture such a high-ranking general point with this merit, they and their families can live a prosperous life. However, Amd Pasha rushed towards the Anubis army and was cut into pieces in an instant. In this battle, the Ottoman army was defeated, 4,000 people were killed, and countless wounded. 15,000 people were captured. Among them, less than 500 people died in the shelling. Amd Pasha died in the battle, and Avoni Pasha died. Captured. Egypt, Manio Palace. Ali picked up the wine glass and took a deep sip, slapped the battle report on the table, and shouted, "Okay." The battle went so smoothly that Ali couldn't believe it. The new Ottoman army was so vulnerable. With this victory, the Ottoman Empire could cede territory and pay compensation. He would seize Anatolia and eventually use the Tigris River as the border with Russia. The Ottoman Empire was divided. What he has to do now is to prevent the interference of the great powers, and for this, he must show sufficient strength. Muhammad Ali had two options. One was to launch a blitzkrieg and sign a treaty with the Ottomans before the powers intervened. The other was to give Britain, which had always opposed him, a hard blow to make the powers fear him. A British naval fleet consisting of 374 battleships and 5 frigates will pass through the Mediterranean Sea to demonstrate in Beirut, which is controlled by Egypt. If they can be eliminated, the French will definitely stand more firmly on their side, and at the same time, let the British know that they are not easy to mess with. The Ottoman Empire's fleet rebelled, and the new army collapsed. It could only rely on some miscellaneous troops and militia to support itself. Fortunately, Muhammad Ali's reputation was very bad, and the civilians did not want to accept this brutal ruler, so they joined in the fight against the Egyptian army. This allowed Ali to quickly seize Anatolia and force the Ottoman Sultan to sign an alliance under the city. Now he can only take the risk and choose the second path. At the same time, he also believes that this must be God's instruction. On the other hand, Metternich convened a meeting of the great powers, based on the Treaty of Mönchengladbach, with the purpose of protecting the interests of the great powers in the Ottoman Empire. At this meeting in history, Metternich not only ruined all his political resources, but also exposed the weak nature of Austria. From then on, the center of European diplomacy moved from Vienna to London. But this time is different. The Austrian army has completed the change of equipment, and the navy has expressed that it is fully capable of facing any emergencies and dealing a devastating blow to the enemy who dares to invade. At the same time in history, Austria's fiscal revenue was only 140 million florins, but at this time, Austria's fiscal revenue exceeded 200 million florins historically. Hungary, which was unable to dance well, had just experienced a civil strife and was severely weakened. It also looked extremely weak because it missed 2 key periods of the German customs union and the development of railways almost at the same time as the Austrian troops arrived in Novi Sad. Miloš Obrenović's bloody letter arrived in Vienna. In Miloš's blood letter, he first said that he had been deceived into believing the Russians' lies, and then said how despicable the Russians and those Serbian traitors were, and how much the Serbian people longed for the early arrival of the Austrian heavenly troops. Finally, the signature at the end is signed by Miloš Obrenović, the most loyal servant of the Habsburg family. Although Miloš Obrenović's behavior was disgusting, he did provide the Austrian Empire with an excuse. In Metternich's eyes, as long as Serbia is captured, Austria will no longer have any worries in the Balkans, but in Franz's eyes, this would plunge Austria and Russia into a life and death situation. How could the Tsar, who claimed to be the guardian of the Orthodox Church, allow a Slavic country to be annexed by the pagan Austria? Vienna, Belvedere Palace. The first owner of this palace was Prince Eugen, who reversed the offensive and defensive trends of Austria and the Ottoman Empire. Palmerston had no good impression of Metternich, but he felt that Austria would definitely consider its own interests to prevent French expansion. As long as the French were squeezed out, Britain could economically colonize Egypt, and then make the entire Near East a Britain's dumping ground for goods and origin of raw materials. Prussia, on the other hand, has a mentality of watching the show, trying to see if it can cause some trouble for Austria and France, and get some benefits by the way. France sent people to attend the peace conference, and urged Egypt to sign a peace agreement with her Ottoman Empire. At this time, France is going to war everywhere, and its national power is already overwhelmed. Now if there is another war, the tragedy of the French Revolution may be repeated. Russia has always disliked big powers acting together, because it would affect Russia's monopoly rights, but the recent movements of Austria and Novi Sad forced the Tsar to send people to test Austria's attitude. At this time, what the Tsar hoped most was that the Ottomans could sign a city alliance with Egypt, and then take advantage of the war between Britain and France to have another Russo-Turkish war. After all, the Russo-Turkish war was a pleasure for the Tsar to fight once and for all. The Tsar was not interested in commercial supremacy, he wanted real land. There may be more updates after Get Off Work Early Today chapter 168. Everyone has their own agenda. The Ottoman Empire has declined, and its territory has become a burden to it. Muhammad Ali, a civilized man in a barbaric world, under his leadership Egypt can become the Ottoman one. The first person to speak was French Representative Thiers. Someone once said of Thiers that his political activities are the chronicle of French political disasters and a dwarf monster trying to wield Napoleon's sword, suppressing the workers' uprising in Lyon, advocating foreign wars, opposing British intervention in the European continent, and bloody suppressing the Paris Commune. He was considered a spiritual Roman. Palmerston habitually interrupted other speeches. He never thought there was anything wrong with this. Britain's strong national power was what he relied on. For what? To become a French colony. The Egyptians are unwilling to do business with us, and only want to talk to you French people. In fact, except for Britain and France, the participating powers had very limited trade relations with the Ottomans, especially Prussia, who exported the most military talents to the Ottomans. The border security between Austria and the Ottomans is comparable to that of war-torn Afghanistan. The trade between the two sides mainly comes from the sea, and Austria has long been an importing country. As for the trade volume, it is only a few tenths of that of Britain and France. Russia's trade is also difficult to describe, so no one except Britain and France cares about trade with the Ottoman Empire. Of course, no one stands up to oppose Palmerston, because it is meaningless and there is a possibility of being bitten by this madman. Joke. Don't you British believe in free trade? Who does Egypt do business with? Does it still need your British consent? You British people have stretched their hands too long. Thiers also retorted. He kept saying very disgusted with Britain's policy of interfering in continental Europe. Mr. Thiers, please shut up. We in the UK believe in free trade, and what we do is to safeguard free trade. The Egyptian government cannot restrict the exports of Egyptian businessmen, let alone the entry of British businessmen. Palmerston said, free trade? Then why do you, the British, not allow our wine to be sold to London, Portsmouth, and Birmingham? Why do you impose heavy taxes on Russian logs? At that time, Russia mainly exported agricultural products, most of which were sold to the United Kingdom, and the logs were heavily taxed by the British. This immediately aroused the resonance of Russian Foreign Minister Nasser Love. He is a diplomat with a military background and his thoughts are not as thoughtful as those present here. Yes, Mr. Palmerston, can you, the UK, reduce your tariffs? They are too high. In fact, Austrian glass products were also sanctioned by the United Kingdom, so Metternich naturally would not miss this opportunity. Yes, there are also glass products from our country. Prussia's Foreign Secretary, Lord Sewell, was also thinking hard about what he should say, and finally came up with something. And our Prussian produce, Palmerston, was a qualified diplomat. When he saw that things were developing against him, he immediately changed his tune. We will consider the opinions of various countries, but shouldn't we discuss today how to safeguard the interests of European countries in the Ottoman Empire? Why don't we continue talking about free trade? When Thiers was about to pursue the victory, his words were interrupted again, this time by Nasser Love. We in Russia hope that you can respect Russia's interests. If the Egyptians attack the Dardanelles, we in Russia are willing to send 150,000 troops to help the Ottoman Empire tide over this crisis. Nasser Love immediately became the focus of the audience. Russia sent 150,000 troops south, which made everyone present feel that Russia planned to continue to encroach on Ottoman territory. This was clearly not in everyone's interests, and Palmerston immediately objected. No, the Russian army must not enter Anatolia. Yes, The Russian army cannot go south. This is a civil war in the Ottoman Empire. Fierce. Also oppose the Russian army going south to fight Egypt. Although the Egyptians performed well in the Ottoman battles, they were not qualified to fight the real powers. And no country in the world can do it to deal with both the Maoziang and Britain at the same time. Historically, it was the strong opposition from Britain and France, as well as the support from Prussia and Austria, that prevented the bear from going south. However, Prussia and Austria did not express their position at this time, and the Russians had no intention of retreating. Palmerston said immediately, "Shouldn't we maintain the status quo in the Near East? Mr. Metternich, don't you also support the rule of the Ottoman Sultan?" "Yes, we support the Ottoman Sultan to continue to rule the Ottomans, but why should we prevent the Russians from going south?" Of course Metternich knew Russia's purpose of going south, but what did that have to do with Austria? At this time, Austria hopes that Britain, France, and Russia will become one pot of porridge, so that Austria can take the opportunity to quietly make a fortune. Prussia's opinion was of little importance to the nations, so Lord Sewell was ignored. Britain, France, and Russia are in conflict with each other. Austria hopes to reap the benefits of others, and waits for other powers to win over it. Prussia is really powerless in the Near East, and can only play soy sauce. The result of the meeting was, of course, inconclusive. Britain, France, and Russia all hope to pull Austria, which is in a neutral position, towards their side. The first person to find Metternich was Palmerston, who seemed very confident. Palmerston believed that, as long as he explained the current situation in the Near East to Metternich, the latter would immediately join the British side. The strength of Egypt means the strength of France, and France's strength is obviously not in Austria's interests, because France will compete with Austria for the leadership of Italy and Germany. As the Russians move south, they will inevitably strengthen their control over the Ottoman Empire. It will be very difficult for Austria to move eastward, and Russia will also prevent Austria from annexing Germany to the north, because the Tsar does not want to see a powerful Austria. Historically, Metternich followed this idea, and served as Palmerston's younger brother. But in the end, he discovered that Britain was also an obstacle to Austria. At this time, Austria already had the power to protect itself. Coupled with Franz's analysis and the pitifully weak fleet sent by the British. Metternich felt that this was Britain seeking help from its allies, so the arrogant Palmerston came to visit. Palmerston, who came empty-handed, seemed insincere, which made Metternich feel slighted. "Lord Palmerston, your analysis is very wonderful, but our Austrian Empire is not afraid of war. Any country that dares to infringe on our interests will be met with a powerful counterattack by our army. You said that there are no permanent friends in this world, only eternal interests, and we will only stand on the side that is in line with the interests of the Austrian Empire." Metternich was doing take eye, but Palmerston obviously didn't want to take the action. He was like a spoiled child who didn't get candy right away, so he left with a harsh word, "Short-sighted. You will regret it." Chapter 169. Everyone has their own agenda. The second person to find Metternich was the French. Thiers hated Metternich very much, a man who participated in the dismemberment of Napoleon's empire. But now France needs allies. At least it cannot let Austria fall to the British side, otherwise Egypt will face catastrophe. This is of course not the strength of the Austrian Imperial Navy, but that Austria can provide supplies to the British fleet, while preventing the French fleet from participating in the siege of the British fleet. Thiers had the confidence to deal with Britain, but he did not have the confidence to fight the whole of Europe. He believed that the root cause of Napoleon's failure was that he had made too many enemies, so he did not want to follow in his footsteps. Thiers expressed his willingness to support Austria in establishing the Apennine Customs Union in Italy, and at the same time, he could share the Egyptian colony with Austria. Metternich was not satisfied with the conditions offered by Thiers, because the Apennine Customs Union did not need French support at all, and after Egypt was defeated, Austria could also share Egypt's resources with Britain. Mr. Thiers, I think you should know that the Apennine Customs Union is currently only participated by countries ruled by members of the Habsburg family, and it should not need your support. As for Egypt's resources, you France cannot eat them, and they will definitely willing to do business with Austria. Mr. Metternich, believe me, once the British enter Egypt, they will find a way to monopolize the export of Egyptian cotton. By that time, the safety of the raw materials of the Austrian textile industry will be in the hands of the British. Thiers said, aren't there Americans? I heard that Brazilians have also begun to grow cotton. I believe we will no longer worry about cotton in the future. Metternich replied. Thiers was unwilling to transfer actual benefits to Austria because Austria was not strong enough and was not worth the greater cost. The conversation between the two parties naturally broke up unhappily. At this time, Thiers pinned his hopes on the Egyptians to quickly reach an agreement with the Ottoman Empire to avoid collective interference by the powers, so that France would only have to deal with Britain. Giving up the alliance with the powerful Britain and France was actually not in line with Metternich's usual style, but their offer was too low. They only wanted Austria to do things, but were not prepared to distribute the benefits to Austria. This was unacceptable to him. Nasserlov was much more cheerful than Palmerston and Thiers. Your Majesty, what can I do in exchange for your support? Belgrade is not the whole of Serbia. For this reason, we are willing to exchange the 3 nearby provinces of Tuzla, Sarajevo, and Foča for Serbian land. Metternich did not beat around the bush because he was afraid that the other party would not listen. Understand. Exchanging 3 provinces for 1 province in Serbia should be a profit. Moreover, the populations of these 3 provinces are mainly Serbian, which can definitely greatly strengthen the strength of the Slavs here. I believe His Majesty the Tsar will agree. Nasserlov suddenly thought something was wrong. Wait a minute, Your Excellency the Prince. The 3 provinces you mentioned seem to belong to the territories of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, but Austria can get these lands from the Ottoman Empire first, and then exchange them with Serbia. This is a letter written by the Serbian Grand Duke, Miloš Obrenović, to the Austrian Imperial family. After Prince Metternich finished speaking, he handed a letter to Nasserlov and continued, I think you should know that our Austrian Empire can completely eradicate the pro-Russian faction in Serbia under the guise of helping to counter the rebellion, and then take the opportunity to support a puppet state. This transaction is entirely based on the long-standing friendship between the 2 countries. After hearing this, Nasserlov was convinced that he could not decide on this transaction, but he felt that it was necessary to let His Majesty the Tsar know the importance of this transaction. In subsequent negotiations, Austria and Russia were on the same side, which forced Britain and France to briefly join forces to prevent Russia from moving south. In fact, Russia has no intention of going south unless the Egyptians intend to break the secret agreement with Russia and get involved in the Balkans or the area north of the Euphrates River. However, the sense of oppression given by the European military police Russia was so strong that Britain and France had to work together to defend themselves against the enemy. But Russia has the support of Austria. These 2 countries join forces and have no rivals in the Balkans, just as the 2 sides were at a stalemate. Mehmed II died July 1, 1839. Mehmed II, who had been ill in bed for a long time, received bad news one after another. First, the fleet he spent heavily on building surrendered to the Egyptians, and then the new Ottoman army, which he devoted all his efforts to build, suffered a disastrous defeat in the 4th Battle of Nizib. Almost completely destroyed, and his most trusted general died in battle. Mehmed II roared with all his strength, the king is not the king who will subjugate the country, and the ministers are not the ministers who will subjugate the country. In fact, the people's wisdom is not yet enlightened, and the king still need to work hard. After that, the whole person fell down, as if he had been drained. At this time, his heir, Abdul Mejid, came over with medicine. Mejid, although you are weak, you are my smartest son. You will definitely become the greatest sultan in the future. If you want to take advantage of the contradictions between the great powers and fight for the interests of the Ottoman Empire, you must open up the people's wisdom. Otherwise the people will, if you only recognize gold and not the country, you will still fall short in the end. Father, drink the medicine. Mahmud Second drank the medicine, and shortly after lying down, his eyes widened, he vomited a mouthful of black blood, and died. Although Mehmed II was known as the first thief of the Ottoman Empire at the time, later generations ranked him as one of the greatest sultans. Mehmed II was different from his great ancestors, in that he was not a military genius or a diplomat who was good at playing with people's hearts. Under his rule, the territory of the Ottoman Empire continued to shrink, and national sovereignty continued to be undermined. However, during his reign, he cleared the obstacles to reform for the Ottoman Empire, and used far-sighted planning to halt the decline of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire thus got a chance to be reborn, and began to slowly move in the direction of a modern country. After the death of Mehmed II, his 16-year-old son Abdülmecid succeeded to the throne as Sultan. Majid looks gentle and gentle, with no shadow of the fierceness of his ancestors. His slender arms are even called the thinnest sultan. However, beneath his frail appearance, he hides a huge ambition that is not inferior to that of his ancestors. Without making a move, Majid replaced all the important ministers in the palace with his own confidants. Those ministers who opposed him were either suddenly killed or transferred to the front line to fight against the Egyptian army. What he inherited was a country riddled with holes. There were religious sects and reactionary forces inside who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to seize power. Outside, Muhammad Ali's army was approaching step by step. Just when everyone thought that the Sultan would definitely call for domestic forces to unite with the outside world. But Majid made a surprising move. He wanted to negotiate peace with Muhammad Ali. At the same time, he asked ambassadors from various countries to come to his flower hall and listen to his speech. Please vote if you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World. It means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 170 Church Hospital Arsenal, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz lay leisurely on Ajani's lap. Compared to Thalia, Ajani was more coaxing and gentle, and she could also sing. Thalia was reading the newspaper for Franz, and the content was of course inseparable from the Spanish Civil War and the recent Second Turkish-Egyptian War. The newspaper also devoted a lot of space to reporting on the persecution of Catholics in Serbia and Bosnia. Those people have been persecuted for more than a day or two. Why did they report it at this time? Of course it was Prince Metternich's handiwork. Prince Metternich fully agreed with Franz's proposal to exchange Ottoman land for Belgrade in Serbia. After all, who can not love a wolf with nothing? Belgrade, as the key to the Balkans, must be in the hands of Austria. However, in order to avoid arousing Russia's anger and Ottoman's excessive vigilance, while Austria takes away Belgrade, it also needs to strengthen Serbia's strength and even allow Serbian forces to surround Belgrade. In addition, the purpose of this exchange was to increase the population of Croatia and control the Serbian population in Austria. Although they were both Yugoslavs, the Catholic Croats were obviously more loyal to the empire than the Serbs. Franz was not idle either. He opened an arsenal in Tyrol. Ajani was a little surprised as to why Franz chose the arsenal in Tyrol. Tyrol had no industrial base and no market, and even if silver mining resumed, it was one of the poorest provinces in Austria. And the most important thing is that there are not enough gun makers. You must know that it takes 3 to 5 years to train a qualified gunmaker. Ajani didn't understand Franz's approach very much. She felt that this approach, which was almost a favor, was unnecessary. Because Franz had donated money to schools, churches, and hospitals in Tyrol more than once before. But in fact, Franz did not pay a penny for these donations. It was the church that paid. Tyrol was a pilot region, dominated by Germans, but with a large Italian population and a small French presence. A byproduct of the Napoleonic Wars, mission schools would forcibly promote German, but education was free and students would be provided with free lunches. Franz wanted to know how strong the resistance would be to the forced introduction of German, and where it would come from. Can free education and free lunch attract poor people to study? Theoretically speaking, it can definitely attract a lot of people under the banner of being free. In addition, it provides real benefits, so local people should flock to it. There is also the issue of cost. Although free education can solve the problem of illiteracy in the short term, it has insufficient staying power and will put economic pressure on the country. If education is treated as an industry, a new problem will soon arise. That is, all resources will inevitably flow to the powerful, and it will eventually become a game for the rich. Then class is solidified, as they do now in Austria. Many nobles not only held official positions, but were also capitalists, and received higher education. Different from the historical stereotypes, the aristocrats of this period were generally well educated, and of high quality. They were not all fat-bellied, ignorant, deformed monsters. If Doppler had not met Franz, he would still be working as a junior high school teacher. This is thanks to the fact that he was born into a family of masons who had money to support his education. If Mendel had not received the generous support of a nobleman, he could only mow lawns for others. With his father, Hermann von Helmholtz was one of the greatest physicists in human history. In order to make a living, he planned to give up his beloved natural sciences, apply for Berlin Medical College, and prepare to serve for 8 years. To repay his tuition. Franz only used a scholarship of 300 florins per year to trick him into Vienna. Of course, a job was also arranged for him. As soon as he graduated in 1843, he would enter the Royal Academy for Women in Vienna. By then, would he like to teach or work? The experiments are up to him. In fact, not only his work, but also his lifelong events, Franz had prepared them for him. And those noble women would not run away with him easily. Anyway, historically this guy was practicing medicine while writing those physics masterpieces in his spare time. If you move to a place with a better academic atmosphere, there is no reason for it to become worse. In fact, in addition to physics, this guy has also made major achievements in the fields of physiology, chemistry, mathematics, philosophy, aesthetics and other fields while practicing medicine. Like the two mentioned before, he is a genius who is completely ahead of his time. Since the time of Queen Nissa, education has been an important means of breaking down class barriers. Only mobility between classes can bring sufficient vitality to society. The Spanish gold diggers were like this, the British pirates were like this, and the French who once challenged Europe alone were like this. Next door, Osman Mahmud II had great vision, skill, and determination. He also had many loyal ministers and generals, and a large number of reformers emerged. However, he failed miserably. The 19th century was an era of rapid progress. At this time, Franz could still be considered a genius, but in a dozen years he would only be at the level of an ordinary college student. A few decades later, he might be a high school student. Maybe he will survive. So education would be a top priority for the Austrian Empire, and the experiments in Tyrol and Chenla were just the beginning. The mission hospital was prepared by Franz to spread Chinese medicine. At this time, Western medicine was just in its infancy, and was still very immature. Although great achievements had been made in fields such as surgery, some fields and medical ideas were still very backward. Especially for some difficult and complicated diseases in the colonies, Western medicine methods were often useless, and it was not conducive to the spread of religion. As for traditional Chinese medicine, something that cannot be explained at present, is exactly what the church is interested in. Nothing can better prove the existence of God than something that is effective and unclear. Amen. Compared with traditional Chinese medicine, the church has two huge advantages. One is trust, and the other is not hiding anything. People's spiritual power is powerful. Sometimes even a bowl of talisman water with incense ash can save a person's life, let alone a decoction that can cure diseases. If the rescuer and the rescued have the same beliefs, they will be more empathetic. The treatment process will be relatively smooth, and they can even provide each other with courage to overcome difficulties. The concealment of traditional Chinese medicine has wiped out many unique skills discovered by chance. But the church does not have this trouble. Every priest who discovers a new drug is eager to name the drug after himself, so how can he conceal it? Look outside and inside, know the subtleties, and balance changes with constant changes. This sentence contains the essence of traditional Chinese medicine, and Franz printed it on every textbook for church doctors at the same time. When promoting traditional Chinese medicine, we must not forget that Western medicine can truly cure diseases. Archbishop Prussia was very interested in anything that could spread religion, and gave great support to missionary schools and missionary hospitals. As for those churches, Franz could only say that in this painful era, the people need comfort even more. Ajani felt that Franz's construction of the arsenal in Tyrol was expensive and laborious, and there was no market for it. But in fact, in his future plans, the arsenal was not used for commercial profit, but belonged to a secret agency of the Austrian Empire. Since it does not exist for profit, at least not yet, the weapons it produces will only be equipped with a small number of troops, and Franz knows one thing very well: the more secretive the research and development of weapons, especially new weapons, the better. Finally, from a security perspective, Tyrol's terrain is easy to defend and difficult to attack, and it is a relatively loyal area. After all, it is an old area with a relatively strong public base. Chapter 171 Speech in the Flower Hall. Grand Sala Quilio Palace, Flower Hall. This was originally the place where the Ottoman palace pastry chef prepared rose preserves, so it was filled with delicate roses, and the sweet fragrance filled the entire Flower Hall. This time it was not only Ottoman officials who came to hear the imperial edict, but also foreign envoys and journalists, who were not normally invited to such ceremonies. Soon those Western envoys and reporters saw for the first time the rumored weak Sudan. The 16-year-old Majid looked slim and inoffensive, which endeared him to some people. After all, the Ottomans were once a monster that straddled the middle of Eurasia, and even indirectly led to the era of geographical discovery. It may be a good thing for everyone that such a harmless boy leads this empire that once made the world fearful. The boy spoke, his voice very soft, saying each sentence first in Ottoman and then in English. This allowed many people to see a learned sultan, and British ambassador Canning even called him a civilized man in the Eastern world. Majid felt that Britain was the most powerful country in the world at this time. He was dressed in a suit and did not choose to wear a military uniform in order to release goodwill to the West and show that he was different from past rulers, but he spoke English instead of other languages, which made some officials feel slighted. In essence, the Imperial Edict of Flower Hall was a continuation and extension of Mahmud II's reforms. It carries various plans and ideas of Mahmud II, and adds more Western element and Megid's own understanding. This is not so much a public edict as a constitution. In fact, this imperial edict is considered to be the earliest constitution in the East. In the end, Majid himself swore an oath to the fundamental concepts of the imperial edict and the resolutions made by the deliberative body, which further verified this view, but in the end the witness was changed from God to Allah. The imperial edict of the Flower Hall established that the lives, honor, and property, as well as freedom and security of Ottoman citizens were protected by law. Economically, the backward tax farming system was replaced by a fixed taxation system. Most European countries abolished this system during the French Revolution. Austria reformed this system during the period of Queen Issa. In the late period of Joseph II this system was restored. Militarily, it once again proposed the training of a new army, established a normal recruitment process, clarified the service period of soldiers, and followed the example of Prussia in implementing a universal conscription system. Judicially, fair and open trials are required, and relevant laws are enacted to punish those who are punished without a legal trial. One of the most radical and eye-catching reforms is, all subjects of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of race or creed, enjoyed the same rights. This sentence can be understood as a national assimilation policy, or it can be understood as an elimination of the differences between Shia and Fang, Orthodox, and Catholics. In theory, all Ottoman citizens had the same rights in law, taxation, property, education, and selection, and the military and government services. In fact, the first Armenian genocide would soon come. This massacre targeted Catholics in Armenia. The reason was that Armenian sheep ate Turkic crops and polluted the river with their feces until the complete disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The Armenians did not receive so-called equal rights, so Franz is not worried at all. The reforms of the Ottoman Empire will really bring it back to its peak point. The ambassadors and reporters present praise Majid as a benevolent and enlightened monarch. For a time, the Imperial Edict of the Flower Hall was published on the front pages of major European newspapers. People have speculated whether the Ottoman Empire will become the next Britain or France and become a civilized country. The name Majid spread throughout Europe overnight. In this era of reform, a monarch who is determined to reform is indeed more likely to be accepted by Europeans. The popularity of the Imperial Edict even overshadowed the ongoing Spanish Civil War and the Turkish-Egyptian War, making people forget that the monarch's rule was in danger. But in the eyes of the Tsar, the Imperial Edict of the Flower Hall was nothing more than a successful performance. The Ottomans would not choose peace, let alone fulfill their promises. Countless Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire were still in urgent need of salvation from the Tsar regarding the deal proposed by Austria. The Tsar felt that it was inevitable to sacrifice the interests of a small number of people in order to save more Slavs, and as long as Russia is strong enough, it can completely rescue the Slavs trapped in the Austrian Empire in the future. The Tsar judged, based on Austria's transaction conditions, that they did not seem to want to get involved in the Balkans, but wanted to use Serbia as a barrier between Austria and the Ottomans, coupled with the Apennine customs union that the Austrians had just established not long ago. It is not difficult to judge that Austria's focus at this time is Italy. After all, the Habsburg family has ruled Italy for hundreds of years, and it is easier for the Italians there to rule. When Nicholas I was young, he visited Austria. He was deeply impressed by the Austrian army. He had never seen such an unruly force. The Russian army has always been known for its complicated composition, but compared to the Austrian army, it pales into insignificance. The Austrian soldiers spoke a variety of languages. Even if they spoke German, they had all kinds of strange accents. He saw with his own eyes that a Bohemian chef asked a Saxon volunteer to get potatoes. Then the soldier looked at the chef with some confusion and finally climbed up the nearby fruit tree and picked an apple under the other's repeated urging. Note: Austria did not have the word potato at the earliest, and they were more accustomed to calling potatoes apples on the ground. During battle, Austrian soldiers were accustomed to watching what the people next to them were doing instead of listening to commands. This also means that once one soldier makes a mistake, the entire unit will make a mistake. Many times Austrian officers had to use sticks, stones, and even whips to get the soldiers to obey orders. But even so, command confusion still troubles the Austrians, because their officers often come from different regions and use different languages or dialects. Nicholas I was not afraid of such armies, because they would collapse in front of pure Slavs. Palmerston and Canning praised Majid's reforms without the support of the great powers. They could only rely on the domestic people's support for the war. After all, Her Majesty the Queen is so elusive. If the Queen opposes the war, Britain's Near East strategy will become a mess. They had to come up with a solution before things got worse. Otherwise it would end like the Spanish Civil War. Britain must gain hegemony in the Near East, and France and Russia were obstacles historically. The British first united with the French to squeeze out the Russians, and then enlisted the Austrians to squeeze out the French. Finally, they won the Sinai Peninsula in an invincible manner. In this battle, Britain not only killed Russia, but also France. It completed a double defeat of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire in the Near East, and also successfully marginalized Austria. Palmerston's pentakill came so easily that he became even more defiant, until he was dismissed from office by Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. Chapter 172. Everyone depends on their ability. The Times reported that this policy had an astonishing effect and significantly changed the British and French public's view of the Ottoman Empire. Contrary to the flattery of the British, the sophisticated Prince Metternich concluded that Majid's reforms were nothing more than a window dressing trick. Because the timing of this imperial edict is so strange, normally national reforms will only be carried out during a stable period. But now Mahmud II had just passed away, the front line was defeated, the future of the war with Egypt was unclear, and there were even more tigers and wolves around him. Ottoman, who was at the center of the storm, actually wanted to reform. There is no doubt that this move is to retreat in order to advance. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire is obviously not in the interest of Britain. Majid knew that he could only ask for help from Britain at this time. Russia would definitely take the opportunity to seek greater benefits by sending troops, which would make the Ottoman Empire even more passive. But the British seem to be planning to stand still, so he will leave things to chance and let the British take action. And even if Majid wanted to rely on Osman's own strength, it would be almost impossible to reverse the decline. First of all, the Ottoman Empire has lost more than half of its navy. If there is another maritime conflict with Egypt, it will definitely lose. Secondly, once the troops on the northern front withdraw south, Russia and the Austrian Empire may participate in the gluttonous feast of carving up the Ottoman Empire. By then, even if Britain takes action, it will not be able to reverse the situation. Simply put it aside, if Britain really doesn't take action, then it can make unilateral peace with Egypt. After all, the current situation is stronger than others, and there will be no need to worry about having no firewood. Ottoman is still much larger than Egypt. As long as he is given enough time to reform, he will definitely be able to train an army that can defeat the Egyptians. But Metternich also smelled a glimmer of opportunity. Perhaps the clever Sultan would be willing to make a deal with Austria and exchange worthless Bosnia for peace in the Ottoman Empire. But in any case, due to the influence of the Imperial edict, more and more Europeans came to the Ottoman Empire to seek opportunities. They hoped to benefit from this reborn empire. The Imperial Edict of the Flower Hall set off a wave of enthusiasm for joining the army among non-Xi and Fang religious subjects in the Ottoman Empire. Countless pagans and low-status ethnic minorities declared to fight for the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, a large number of guerrillas appeared in the rear of the Egyptian army, seriously hindering the progress of the Egyptian army. Ali's eldest son Ibrahim felt a little worried. In his eyes, the guerrillas were more difficult to deal with than the Ottoman army. The Sinai Peninsula is already having difficulty supplying supplies. If the war continues for too long, Egypt's national power may be overwhelmed. Moreover, the British and Russians were like two sharp swords above his head, making him unable to sleep or eat well. On the other side, Muhammad Ali has also prepared the stage. He has been preparing for this big show for 10 years, and now he is waiting for the British to enter. The representative of France, Guizot, was licker of the British. He always believed that France must have a good relationship with the British if it wanted to rise, so he also strongly touted Majid's reforms. Fears once again urged Muhammad Ali to reach an agreement with the Ottoman Empire as soon as possible to avoid interference by the powers, but he also reiterated France's attitude that France was not afraid of Britain. However, the impact of the Imperial Edict of the Flower Hall was still unable to completely offset the impact of the death of Mahmud I. The British have expressed concerns about the prospects of the Ottoman Empire. After all, the current war situation is not conducive to the Ottomans, and it is still unknown how much impact the death of the monarch will have on this ancient empire. However, this also strengthened the determination of Palmerston and Canning. Despite their repeated requests, a British naval fleet consisting of 374 battleships and 5 frigates will pass through the Mediterranean Sea to demonstrate in Beirut, which is controlled by Egypt. It is already on its way. Another powerful fleet led by the first-class battleship King is on its way. In addition to the Sovereign, this fleet also has 11 third-level battleships and more than 10 auxiliary ships at this time. The Egyptian Navy apparently had 2 second-level battleships, 15 third-level battleships, and hundreds of light gunboats of various types. In addition to the surrender of the Ottoman Navy, there were 3 first-class battleships, 4 second-class battleships, and 4 third-class battleships. Egypt's maritime capital ships have reached an astonishing 28, and it even has behemoths like the Mahmud. The maritime power sent by the British seems to be insufficient, but in fact the shipbuilding technology of the Egyptians and the Ottomans is far inferior to that of the British, and the naval quality is also very different. The Egyptians' first-class ships may not be as good as those of the British. The level of human third-class ship. Historically speaking, the British have given the Egyptians enough face this time. Last time, the British only used 274 ships, third-class battleships, to defeat the Turkish-Egyptian coalition. Ali prepared to let the Egyptian Navy warm up by ambushing the British Mediterranean fleet. Russia wanted to send troops to the Sinai Peninsula, but was rejected by the Ottoman Empire. This was of course the British behind it, otherwise they would not have dared to reject the Tsar's proposal. Because of Majid's courage. At the same time, Nasserov's Anglophobia occurred, and he tried his best to dissuade the Tsar from being impulsive. The Tsar still trusted him very much, but the British made him unhappy and simply did not send a fleet to join the British advance fleet. Austria did not join the British fleet out of its own considerations. After all, Austria had not reached an agreement with the British at this time, and it was not willing to be Britain's little brother as it had done historically. Friedrich even learned from the intelligence of the Karamanli family that the Egyptians had assembled a powerful fleet to attack the British advance fleet. How could Friedrich miss such a good opportunity to enjoy a meal and watch a show? He immediately ordered all ships of the Austrian navy to huddle within the Adriatic Gulf and not to attack. Friedrich did not take action, partly because Austria and Britain had not reached an agreement, and partly because the negotiations between Austria and the Ottomans had not yet concluded. At the same time, he did not feel that now was the time to attack. At this time, the Egyptians' nerves were tense and their troops were sufficient. Choosing this time to launch a sneak attack is tantamount to hitting an egg against a stone. The King of France, Louis Philippe, was not interested in Thiers' proposal. He felt that war should be avoided as much as possible, because it would destroy France's good situation at this time. France has little internal interest in economic colonization. They prefer direct occupation as they did in Algeria. This, coupled with France's great success in Texas, reinforced their belief in this. In addition, the civil war between Spain and the Central American Federation also greatly affected France's energy. Even within the Bonapartist faction, there are very few people who support Thiers. Now he can only hope that the Egyptian Navy can defeat the British Navy. The Five-Nation Conference did not reach an agreement, and now the great powers are preparing to compete for the interests of the Near East, based on their own abilities. Metternich also came to Istanbul, and he was ready to meet this wise man in person. Chapter 173. A desperate move. Ottoman, Istanbul. The Grand Zerakulio Palace, also known as the Cannon Gate, feels really majestic. It's just that the Ottoman national power now makes Metternich no longer afraid in his heart. Europeans once regarded the Ottoman Empire as the scourge of God, and because of the brutality of successive sultans, every ambassador who came here would leave a will first. There is a mural called Disasters from God in Graz Cathedral in Austria, which vividly illustrates that for the people under the Habsburg rule at that time. The Ottoman attack was as big a disaster as the Black Death and the Passage of Locusts. It's just that this ancient empire that captured Constantinople and besieged Vienna twice, when its defenders saw Metternich, their eyes were filled with fear. Although the Ottomans often gave Europeans nicknames to humiliate them, due to the appearance of the Russians, a deep fear was rooted in the hearts of the Ottomans. Even the officials responsible for receiving Metternich could not help but tremble in their arms. This fear came directly from the Austrian fleet anchored in the port. In order to show off for Metternich, Austria brought over all the huge battleships that had exceeded their service life. The pier was already crowded with people looking for something to do. This was a huge fleet that they had never seen before. In addition to the giant sail ships, there were also many strange ships without sail oars at this time. The Ottoman navy only had a few light gunboats left for show, and did not dare to block the Austrian fleet. Metternich should be regarded as the highest ranking Western official who visited Istanbul. Majid was a little surprised by Metternich's visit to the Grand Zerakulio Palace. The previous Five-Nation meeting did not reach an agreement, but only drafted a proposal and handed it to the Ottoman government, asking them to stop peace talks with Egypt. Majid felt that Britain had been forced to take action and his goal had been achieved, so there was no need to continue talking with the Egyptians. So the Egyptian envoy, who was halfway through the journey, hurried back again. Majid was a man addicted to pleasure. He felt that the external crisis had been resolved, so he began to have fun in the flower hall with his concubines. He felt very unhappy at being disturbed. The young sultan seemed to be planning to put the Austrian envoy to dry in order to kill his spirit. The newly appointed Grand Vizier by Megid was Mr. Forrest. He was once a diplomat, and of course he knew what level Metternich was, so he hurriedly reminded him, the great sultan, Metternich was Prime Minister of Austria. So, what? Majid said with some disdain. In his heart, he had blind confidence in Britain's strength. This Prime Minister Metternich is known as the Prime Minister of Europe. He established a structure to maintain peace for decades, and he has not left Austria for a long time. You, Sultan, need to meet such a powerful person. It's really disappointing. Let him come in the afternoon. I'll take a nap first. When Mustafa saw the Sultan's attitude. It was really difficult to connect the arrogant and pleasure-obsessed young man in front of him with the monarch, who was determined to reform a few days ago. In fact, it is true that Majid wants reform, and it is also true that he is addicted to pleasure. In his heart, he felt that the Ottoman Empire, with its successive wise kings, was far superior to the West, but it was only the people who were too stupid that they lagged behind the West. Especially after the Imperial Edict of Huating, the praises he received from those Westerners made him look down on those stupid Westerners. It's really ridiculous that I just used a little trick to deceive those Westerners. Although Majid felt that the British had nothing to worry about when they sent troops, Mustafa knew very well that the so-called five-nation proposal was simply a piece of waste paper. The interests of the great powers were hugely divergent, and they could not reach an agreement. The British were preparing to hold another five-nation meeting in London, but France did not receive the invitation, and the Austrian Prime Minister actually appeared in Istanbul. In addition, the Russian envoy repeatedly reiterated Russian monopoly over the Strait. Mustafa was worried about the prospects of the London conference. In fact, his worries were correct. Palmerston tried to ignore the French and enlisted Prussia, Austria, and Russia to sanction Egypt first. After all, it is not easy for Russia to send troops to the Sinai Peninsula, and the newly appointed Sudan has an obvious pro-British attitude. It is only a matter of time before the Ottomans are induced to tear up the agreement with Russia. The most important thing is that Russia will not compete with Britain for business, but the French are different. They have industrial capabilities and trade volume second only to Britain. Moreover, Egypt's interests are highly tied to France, so even if Britain wants to instigate rebellion, it will be unable to do so. Historically, Palmerston was dissatisfied with the outcome of the Congress of Vienna, and convened another five-nation conference in London. This time he left France aside, voided the previous agreement reached at the Congress of Vienna, directly threatened Egypt with force, and even led Russia to the Austrian fleet went to deter Egypt. Afterwards, Egypt had to accept peace and Britain won a great victory. But this time the five-nation agreement was not reached at all, and the French did not receive an invitation. The Russians were still worried about Britain's opposition to their straight hegemony, and after reaching an agreement with Austria, they were not prepared to betray the British. Austria also considered its own interests, and did not choose to be Palmerston's younger brother. Instead, it planned to fight for its own interests. There was no reason to accept Palmerston's order to attend any London conference, let alone send a fleet to replace the British fight. The multinational fleet did not appear, only a lone British fleet. Historically, it was the emergence of multinational fleets that made Ali give up his crazy plan, because he could not make an enemy of the entire Western world. But at this time, a British fleet with only 8 warships dared to bombard Beirut. Ali immediately dispatched his powerful fleet with 28 capital ships. He believed that no British ship would be able to leave the coast of Beirut under the attack of shore batteries, and a powerful fleet. Attacking the British fleet was just a bad idea in Muhammad Ali's mind. What he most hoped for was peace talks with the Ottomans at first. News of Mahmud II's death reached Egypt, causing Muhammad Ali to be ecstatic and shout Allah has eyes, because, in his mind, the Ottoman Empire has been retreating steadily since the beginning of the war. The navy built with a lot of money has mutinied, and the new army with high hopes has been dispersed. Now even the Sultan himself is dead, and the Ottomans seem to have no choice but to surrender. However, the expected collapse did not occur, nor did a large number of Ottomans surrender in response to Allah's call for a greater Arab empire. Later, the newly appointed Sultan was even more confused, and even proposed any reforms at this time. But the development of things once again surprised Ali. Ottoman civilians enthusiastically joined the army, and even Britain and Russia, which had been standing still, began to take action. This forced Ali to make a desperate move. He knew very well that, if these powers were not beaten painfully, they would not listen to him. Chapter 174 The Battle of Beirut. Eastern Mediterranean. A fleet was drifting alone on the sea, and the Union flag hanging high proved their identity. They are the British Near East Advance Fleet, consisting of 3 battleships and 5 frigates. The 3 capital ships are the 3rd-class battleship Birmingham, the 3rd-class battleship Wangshi, and the 3rd-class battleship Newport. Among them, the Wangshi and the Newport are typical 74 ship configurations, and the Birmingham is a super level 3 battleship with a 3-layer gun deck and 80 guns and a displacement of up to 2,100 tons. The flagship of this fleet. Vice Admiral Helmut, dining in his flagship Birmingham. He was the only one at the table, but there were 14 dishes on the table. Generally speaking, the so-called French meal only has 13 courses. The British felt that the number 13 was unlucky and wanted to appear more powerful than the French, so the British Navy's meal consisted of 14 courses. In fact, what the British don't know is that the number 14 also means unknown in the East. The supplies of the British Navy can be said to be the most complete among the navies of this era. In particular, officers' diet was more luxurious, and their bad habits were also learned by the Japanese Navy later. But on the bumpy sea, even the delicious food was not in the mood at the moment. The wine Lieutenant General Helmut had just drank was already a bit drunk. After shaking with the waves a few times, he proudly said to the chef next to him, "Do you know what we are going to do? Go to war, General." The chef didn't know what the Lieutenant General meant, but he knew it was best not to offend this drunkard. "No, we are just traveling. The Egyptian fleet is a joke. I was also present in the naval battle in 1827. I was on the Easter. Do you know how many ships we sunk?" Helmut raised 2 fingers. 2 ships? The chef has been at sea for many years. Although he has never participated in a serious naval battle, he knows that the British Navy must win every battle and there are not many chances to sink the opponent. Helmut shook his head. 3 ships? The chef asked tentatively, which annoyed Helmut. 20 ships. Those Egyptians are just as stupid as you. We can sink their warships every time we fire a cannon. When they find out that our cannons are powerful, they feel like they are fighting a treasonous war with us. What do you think the result will be? Did we win? No. Then we lost. The head chef was a little confused. They were sunk by us before they even got close. There happened to be a group of sharks, and they smelled blood, so they had no choice but to fight with the sharks. Haha, Lieutenant. General Helmut laughed so hard that he almost shed tears, but the chef really didn't know where the laughter was, but he didn't want to offend this drunkard, so he could only laugh awkwardly along with him. Fortunately, at this time, the fog cleared. A messenger ran in and shouted, "Captain, a large number of enemy ships have been discovered. Fighting always makes people's blood boil." The drunkenness on Helmut's face disappeared completely. He grabbed the captain's hat on the table and put it on his head. He took another big gulp of rum and walked out the door. "Mr. Nelson, please help me." Rum is also known as Nelson's blood in the British Royal Navy. Nelson is as famous as Napoleon, the god of war on the sea, and is known as Napoleon of the Sea. Unlike other people in this book, who call themselves Napoleon, he is not self-proclaimed, and there is no derogatory meaning. He is definitely not the kind of person who everyone calls Napoleon after Napoleon's death. Napoleon's clown. The sea breeze blew by, the fog dispersed, and Helmut seemed to be back in Navarino. The Egyptian fleet is still in the port, seemingly trying to compete with the British Royal Navy with the advantage of its forts. Helmut observed with a telescope that there were almost hundreds of Egyptian gunboats, large and small, plus brigs and 3-masted sailing ships, and about 30 coastal defense guns. However, there was a contemptuous smile on Helmut's lips. How many mediocre people in the British Royal Navy could be considered squadron commanders? Helmut saw the weakness of the Egyptians at just one glance. Those ships basically used 3 to 4 pound guns. Those shore defense guns looked mighty and domineering, but he knew the Egyptians' skill in forging cannons. The cannons weighed nearly 10,000 kilograms and had a caliber between 10 and 12 pound. For a battleship with such powerful artillery, it is basically a scrape. Taking his Birmingham as an example, it has a displacement of 2,200 tons. The bottom gun deck is equipped with 32 pound cannons, the middle gun deck is equipped with 24 pound cannons, and the upper gun deck is equipped with 20 16-pound long-barreled guns. The bow and stern are each equipped with 2 32 pound Karen cannons to deal with approaching small ships. The Birmingham can dump half a ton of shells at a time, which is almost equal to the total firepower of the opponent. What is even more frightening is that the British artillery uses solid drilling and boring technology, which is not comparable to the Egyptian cannons. Soldier, go back to your post, signal the signal, and ask Major General John to line them up in a horizontal line, 1,200 meters away, and prepare to meet the enemy. Although the Egyptian Navy had long known that the British Navy was coming to bombard Beirut, they were still shocked when the British Navy actually appeared. Because of the heavy fog, when the Egyptian Navy discovered the British fleet, the distance between the two sides was only 2 kilometers. This also resulted in many people still eating on the shore or preparing supplies. The enemy ship is attacking. The enemy ship is attacking. A soldier sounded the alarm, which then sounded throughout Beirut's port. However, they still missed the best opportunity. Before the Egyptian Navy boarded the ship, the British had already set up a battle formation. As the gun deck was opened layer by layer, the black holes of the gun muzzles were revealed. Then as General Helmut gave the order to shoot freely, countless black projectiles flew towards the fort and the helpless Egyptian sailing ships' shells exploded in the port of Beirut. As the Egyptians were rushing to prepare for war and the crowds were concentrated, the scattered shrapnel immediately caused large-scale destruction. But the fire caused by the combustible material inside caused more chaos than the shrapnel. The Egyptian forts were the target of Helmut's call. After all, he felt that the small Egyptian sailing ships posed no threat to his battleships and his mission is only to intimidate with artillery fire. The capture of Beirut was not within the scope of his responsibilities. Of course, if these Egyptians wanted to die, he wouldn't mind giving them a ride. After 4 rounds of artillery fire from the British Navy, the Egyptian counterattack finally began. The fort cooperated with the large mast ship to shoot at the British Navy 1 kilometer away. However, it only caused a wave of waves. Very few of them could hit the British ships. Even if they did hit, it would be as Helmut estimated, and it would have no effect at all. Just when Helmut proudly ordered to continue firing freely, a huge Egyptian fleet was passing through the fog, and the main force of the Egyptians was about to arrive on the battlefield. Chapter 175 Beirut Naval Battle. The coast of Beirut is full of traces of exploding shells, and almost all the artillery on the 4 forts have been silenced. Next to the burning artillery, there were countless corpses of gunners stacked up. Many of them died with their eyes open, because the shells they fired could not reach the British warships at all. However, the supervising team behind them threatened their lives and families, forcing them to resist pointlessly. The situation on the pier was even more tragic. A shell landed on the pier of the pier. The old wood suddenly turned into debris and flew towards the surrounding crowd. People at the center of the explosion were directly blown away by the shockwave. In the air, there was a free fall. The British Army fired not only blooming artillery shells, but also incendiary bombs and solid shells. Compared with destroying the trestle, the effect of solid shells was still more important. A solid bullet hit the trestle, ricocheting and destroying a large number of wooden structures, just like water wasted. Since the British Army launched an indiscriminate attack, the warships and merchant ships in the harbor were beaten to pieces. The British fleet fought very well, but after pouring dozens of tons of artillery shells, the Egyptian Navy also began to counterattack. Egypt knew very well that its artillery was not as good as that of the British Army, and shooting from a long distance was for nothing, so it just attacked them. One by one, the 2-masted sailing ships sailed towards the British fleet. The other captains of the fleet asked Commander Helmut if they wanted to retreat and keep shooting at a distance. Helmut sneered. Now that he had seized the T-head, there was no reason to give up, and those Egyptian warships posed no threat at all. In addition to the 2-masted warships, the Egyptian Navy also has a large number of light gunboats. These gunboats often only have 1 or 2 carronades. They use their own lightness to quickly approach enemy ships, directly attack the bottom of the ship, or use great bombs. Kill and injure deck personnel. This was the tactic of the Barbary pirates back then. France, Austria, Sardinia and other countries also had a large number of light gunboats to counter the Barbary Navy's fast attack tactics. In addition, the Egyptian Navy also has a large number of sampans. These sampans usually only have 10 to 20 people and carry items such as hooks, machetes, and kerosene. The purpose is to get close to enemy ships and fight with them. The same is true of Barbary. Pirate tactics were later inherited by Somali pirates. Tell the captains to stop the bombardment and move closer to attack. Don't let any fish slip through the net. The messenger immediately raised the flag, and the British fleet's bombardment stopped. This was not a fair contest in the first place, and they did have the right to be proud. But where the British couldn't see it, 4 huge winches were turning, and 4 artillery pieces, which the Egyptians called heads, were being pulled out of their emplacements at the same time. Egypt's main fleet, a total of 28 battleships, plus nearly 100 auxiliary ships, the flagship has broken through the fog and arrived on the battlefield. However, due to the heavy fog, there was a problem with the command of the Egyptian Navy. Instead of launching a battle formation immediately, it rushed directly towards the British fleet. The sudden appearance of a huge fleet caused confusion in the British. The captains asked Helmut for instructions whether to leave the battlefield. Lieutenant General Helmut was also caught in a dilemma. At this time, the number of Egyptian warships was unknown. If they continued to fight, they would most likely be surrounded. But if you just run away, if the other party follows and pursues you, your own losses will not be small. Although this can save the fleet, your reputation and future may be completely ruined, and it will also affect the British Navy's reputation of always fighting the enemy. The most important thing is that the British fleet is now at the T-head of the battle, but after escaping, it will become the T-tail. The surrounding fog makes it impossible for Helmut to judge whether there are enemy troops in other directions. His intuition told him that this was a trap specially prepared for him, and his experience told him that it was time to make a contribution. Tell them, don't panic and remember Nelson. Every time the British Navy faces life and death, it will think of this hero who saved Great Britain several times. On March 13, 1811, in the Battle of Lissa, Captain Horst led a British squadron of 4 battleships and was surrounded by a French fleet twice as many as his own. At the critical juncture, Horst hoisted the flag "Remember Nelson" on his flagship, boosting the morale of the British ships and defeating the United Fleet in one fell swoop. The mention of Nelson really stabilized the morale of the British Army and did not collapse due to the two-sided attack by the Egyptian Navy. Helmut took a deep breath and put down the telescope. Tell the fleet to wait until the enemy ship enters 500 meters before shooting. Battleships of this era mainly rely on broadside firepower output, so there is talk of grabbing the T-head. But light gunboats are obviously not included in this category. They only have 1 or 2 guns, and their positions can often be adjusted. The Egyptian light gunboats started shooting at the extreme distance of 800 meters between the two sides, and the warships started shooting at an exaggerated distance of 1000 meters. The result was of course a splash of water around the British fleet. Soon the Egyptian light gunboats and sampans entered within the 500-meter firing range of the British warships, but the British fleet did not open fire. As mentioned before, battleships below level 3 cannot be counted as battleships, and Britain's target has always been those Egyptian battleships. However, the Egyptian Navy on the Beirut side did not have that kind of luck. There were no valuable targets anyway, so the British ships opened fire at will. A rain of bullets fell, and all the sampans and light gunboats hit by the shells were instantly broken into pieces. Even if the ship did not sink, the people on the ship were stunned by the explosion. A brigantine was directly hit by more than a dozen cannonballs. There were howling ghosts on the deck, and even the mast was blown off. The fallen mast directly crushed the sailors below into meat pies. However, the morale of the Egyptian Navy has not collapsed yet, which surprised Helmut. In fact, at this time, the families of the Egyptian Navy were captured by Mohammed and taken to Cairo. If they failed, Ali would expose their families. Adult fuck. The sailors of the Egyptian Navy all rushed towards the British fleet with red eyes and gritted teeth. The British Army and the Egyptian Navy also came into contact on the other side. The first round of shelling by the British Army woke up the crazy Egyptian Navy. The British Army poured half a ton of artillery shells on the Egyptian main fleet at once, causing the latter's fleet to fall into chaos instantly, and began to turn hastily and bombard them from the side. As the number of Egyptian Navy ships increased, the fighting became more and more fierce. Helmut knew that he could not win this battle no matter what. But he was not willing to retreat. He also wanted to create his own legend point, but several loud noises suddenly came from the shore, which made him determined. The 4 Pluto cannons blew up 2 of them, but the other 2 giant cannons actually hit a frigate at the same time. The shells easily broke through the hull of the frigate, and the huge shells exploded in the cabin along with 2 loud noises. The gunpowder on the bottom of the frigate was also ignited, and the huge explosion directly tore the hull. This moment aroused the bloody spirit of the Egyptian navy, especially those sampans that even planned to board British warships directly for hand-to-hand combat. However, their courage did not bring them continued good luck. The carronade guns at the bow and stern of the British warship worked. A round of grapeshot hit the sampan. A layer of blood mist instantly filled the sampan. After the blood mist dissipated, only the sampan was left alone. However, Helmut was no longer in the mood to continue admiring the enemy's misery at this time. He had to retreat, otherwise his fleet would become the first British fleet to be annihilated in the 19th century. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.